Chapter 21. Gideon. Now, you look rested, Gideon said to his mother as he sat at the kitchen island. Not only rested, Gideon thought as he smelled the steaming coffee Maxine put in front of him, but amazingly put together for someone who'd been so emotionally run through the ringer as she'd been last night with Sully. I was exhausted, she said, busying herself at the stove. Bacon sizzled, and scrambled eggs and biscuits, fresh from the oven, added to an already pleasant aroma. I fell right asleep, getting ready for that party last night. You didn't need to do that, Mom. I wanted to, Gideon. You deserved it. She glanced over her shoulder. Hungry? Starving. Maxine placed a heaping plate of food in front of him, and he dug right in. First thing Gideon had done on his way downstairs was to check in on Sully in the parlor. He hadn't expected to find his father sleeping in the recliner next to Sully's bed, when tradition had Archie awake with the sun. Not just sleeping, thought Gideon, as he'd watched his father from the doorway, but snoring like a bear, with a bottle of Old Sam bourbon on the end table, along with the Capone book Gideon had seen in the third-floor bedroom last night. At some point, his father had come down and passed out where he now sat sprawled in the chair, his clothes untucked and wrinkled. Gideon sipped his coffee and tested the water. Dad okay? Thinking how the roles here had reversed since he'd been gone. Mom, even though she'd always been a cheery go-getter once she got going, had never been a morning person like Dad, yet here she was at 7 in the morning, seemingly showered and made up and hair combed, in tight jeans he'd never seen before, with white sandals that highlighted her pink-painted toenails. Her butter-yellow t-shirt said the beehive is alive, whatever the hell that meant, right across her chest. But the shirt, which showed a plump bumblebee holding a rocks glass, was form-fitting enough to reveal how much weight she'd lost over the past 3 years. Dad okay? He asked again. He's fine, she said with her back to him. Jotting something down in a notebook, she slid into a leather satchel full of other business-looking things. Last Gideon had heard, Maxine had retired from teaching middle school to become Sully's caretaker soon after Gideon had enlisted in the army. But what she'd just been doing had looked a lot like paperwork, which brought his attention back to her t-shirt. The front of it made more sense now that he could see what was printed on the back. Grand opening. Except right before the O in opening, there were 2 slanted letters in red re, like someone had at the last second edited it to say grand reopening how clever followed by a date, November 10, still a month away. But apparently the historic Beehive Hotel, which had thrived in the late 1800s and early 19s, and even more so during Prohibition, was about to open again. The name of the drink on the front of his mother's shirt came back to him. The Honeybee, the hotel's signature drink back in the day, equal parts honey and sugar over crushed ice and filled to the top with whiskey, with enough room for the maraschino cherry. The Beehive had limped through the Depression, gained steam before, during, and after the Second World War, only to slowly founder through the 50s and much of the 60s, find a second life in the late 60s and 70s, before ultimately closing its doors in the winter of 1978. Gideon knew all of this because his father had talked of the Beehive often. Refinishing the Smite House had been his passion outside the college classroom, but the Beehive was his dream. One of these days, he'd tell them at dinner, that hotel will be mine. I will restore it to its former glory, at which Mom would scoff, pretending she was clearing her throat, and say something like, more gravy, Archie? Or can you pass me the potatoes, dear? Anything to change the subject. But with their dinner table situated next to the bay window, the Beehive atop the hill at the end of their street was always in view from Archie's seat. They often saw him staring at it as he chewed, in lust almost, like Gideon often found himself staring at Beth when she'd begun to sprout curves. It's good to have ambition, Maxine once told Gideon when he was a boy after Archie had cursed and sworn from a second-floor bathroom, having accidentally broken a pipe while laying a new tile floor that supposedly perfectly matched the one in 1925, but like anything tangible, it needs to have a ceiling. As educators, and especially after Sully's medical bills started arriving, the Smite house kept them monetarily strained and often stressed. But while his parents occasionally argued over money and Reno projects, they rarely fought, at least not in front of the kids, but the tension over money was always there, biting at them like termites. If the beehive was about to reopen, who was behind it, if not his father? Who would take that on? Everyone in town knew of his dreams for that hotel, but by the looks of him, sleeping alone in that haunted bedroom upstairs, Gideon didn't think it likely he had anything to do with that massive Reno. But could Mom have had something to do with it? By the looks of her shirt and the way his parents were not talking, perhaps she did. Just as Gideon was starting to piece this all together, she turned so suddenly toward Gideon that he jerked on his stool and spilled a splash of coffee on the island. She grabbed a dish towel from the sink and wiped it up. Heroes weren't so jumpy. Heroes didn't open fire with kids in the room. Heroes didn't spill their coffee. And even though she smiled and seemed happy to do it, so quick to be a mother again, he saw the brief spark of disappointment in her eyes that he'd been so easily startled, because maybe it seemed he was still the same old Gideon, jumpy and on edge and scared of his own shadow. She leaned against the counter, folded her arms, smiled at him. Genuinely. She was truly glad he was home, and right now that was enough. But damn if her fingernails weren't painted too, nothing showy, but a modest shade of red that, against the backdrop of her t-shirt, made Gideon think of ketchup and mustard. But she kept staring and smiling, so eventually Gideon said, "What? Can't a mother look at her son?" He sipped his now tepid coffee. "I guess so. Just not sure I'm much to look at." She grabbed his plate, filled it again. "You must have put on 20 pounds of muscle." 30. "But who's counting, right?" She walked behind him and hugged him. She kissed the top of his head. "I'm so glad you're back. I prayed every day, Gideon, and here you are. And here I am." He finished his coffee and suddenly wanted to get up and go outside. The newness of Mom's enthusiasm was nice, but with the undercurrent of awkwardness he knew they both felt, he wondered how long it would last before things went back to how they'd been in the days before he'd gone. When Dad had stopped talking to him, and Mom, what she'd done had been, maybe not as obvious, but equally damaging, because she'd always been the one to smile and show compassion and ask questions like how his day went and what are you doing after school and what's Beth up to. Those questions went away after Sully's injury. And as annoying to a teenager as those daily questions were, they hadn't been asked in jest, or just to fill airspace. She genuinely cared. And while she'd outwardly shouted at Archie for blaming Gideon for what happened to Sully inside the tunnel, her silence after the tragedy hurt tenfold. No more daily questions to him had meant she'd stopped caring, and her praying had little to do with him coming home. That had been the bullet, and if they knew the truth of how the bullet had come to travel through his leg, they wouldn't be so quick to call him a hero. "He shouldn't be drinking, Mom." From where she stood behind the island, the Beehive Hotel was in view out the window, and he just knew she was staring at it, just as Archie had always stared at it. "No, no, he shouldn't be, Gideon," she said, looking at him again. This time he didn't spill his coffee. "How's your nose?" "Fine." Although in truth it still throbbed. "I'll take those Advil now, though." She pulled the bottle from a counter drawer and shook 3 out into her palm. She glanced, as if to size him up, and then shook out a 4th. He downed them with the rest of his coffee. "And your shirt?" She looked down at her chest. "Oh, this?" Like she hadn't known she was wearing it. "The Beehive is opening again." "I get that much," he said. "But what's your part in it?" "Who says I?" "Mom, come on. You think you'd be flaunting that shirt around here." "I'm not flaunting." He heard hammering even now from down the street and could only assume it was coming from the Beehive. "Then what gives? You didn't used to be this persistent Gideon." "Well, you know, killing people does that." He hadn't meant for it to come out so harshly. hadn't meant for it to come out at all. What he'd done over there had meant to be buried the instant he'd boarded that plane home. Maxine cleared his plate and rinsed it off in the sink. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and forced a smile, much like she'd done with him after Sully nearly died. "Come here." Maxine rounded the island and motioned for him to follow. Gideon followed her down the hallway and into the foyer toward the front door. She opened it, stepped out onto the sunlit veranda, and stood facing the end of the street as construction carried on at the Beehive. Scaffolding had been erected along the three-story stone facade, where the final touches were being made to the ornate window frames and detailed cornices leading up to the steeply pitched roof. Birds flittered in and out of the colorful autumn trees that lined both sides of Mallard. Workers moved about the hotel like ants on an anthill. Archie had taken the family there a decade ago, before Sully was born. The building had long been abandoned by then, but in every room shown to them by the realtor, Dad had seen potential. He'd seen history and charm and the glory years all folding back again. Mom had told him to close his mouth at one point during the tour of the grand bar inside the lobby. Archie had touched every dusty pillar and fluted column and commented on every floor, down to the woodworking of the baseboards and the downlay of the floorboards and tiles, all while Maxine tried to temper his enthusiasm and remind him with whispers and pats on the back that there was no way they could afford to take on this project with how in debt they were with the Smite house. "But the interest rates, honey, there's never going to be a better time to buy. And just imagine the money this place would bring in." And she'd say, "Money from who, Archie? Nobody visits Harrod's Reach anymore." Which is exactly why we need this place to bring them back. So, build it and they will come. She'd said it tongue-in-cheek, Gideon remembered clearly, but Archie had taken it as full-on seriousness, and answered with a resounding, "Yes, build it and they will come." Dad never saw the eye roll Mom had given him after that, or maybe he had but didn't care, because this place, he kept saying, as happy about life as he'd ever seen him. Gideon had listened around the corner of the living room that night as a fire crackled in the hearth and his parents discussed finances with the realtor, who seemed as convinced of the hotel's good bones as Dad was, all while Mom touched her forehead and sighed a lot and eventually poured them all a drink. Mickey, the realtor, with his fine-looking Jeep Grand Cherokee parked outside, his yellow polo shirt, his nice slacks, shiny shoes, and full head of Ken doll hair, while Dad was trying to hold on to his with a comb-over that wasn't working. "He's just trying to make a sale, Gideon," as she would later tell her son. That's what salesmen do. Mickey shook Dad's hand that night when he left the Smite house. Dad stood at the window watching until Mickey's taillights faded before turning around to face Mom, even though she'd already left the room. Gideon remembered that night as being one of the rare times his parents argued loud enough for him to hear, loud enough for Gideon to weep and attempt sleep with a pillow over his ears. That next morning wasn't much different from this, thought Gideon, as he stood next to his mother and watched the workers hammering and sawing and painting at the Beehive. It had been just him and Mom at breakfast that morning after that argument years ago, Dad apparently having gone to his campus office to grade tests. Mom, still teary-eyed, smiled as coffee wafted into her face, smiled as if she'd won that battle, and said, "Sorry if we kept you up." Gideon had shrugged, a tad disappointed because he'd secretly been on his dad's side, and by default, Mickey's as well. And now here they were with the Beehive a month away from a grand reopening, and Mom was glowing in her yellow tea and newfound body, reveling in the way she seemed to be getting younger, while Dad looked fat and homeless. And then she said, "You remember that realtor who wanted to sell the Beehive to us?" Gideon said, "Yeah." "Well, he bought it." "When?" "2 years ago." She slid her arm inside his for a sideways hug, like this news should make him happy or proud. "Been working on it ever since." It was nice to see that place coming to life, even if it wasn't Archie Dupree doing it. But something felt off, so he said, "And you?" "What about me?" She looked at her shirt again. "Oh, yes, well, Mickey, Yes, Mickey, he hired me a year ago. Marketing, social media, that type of thing. Why you? You don't think I'm qualified. Overqualified is more like it. We needed money, plain and simple. Okay, and maybe that had come out more harshly than she'd intended because she immediately softened, sideways hugged him again. He sensed defensiveness, like maybe it wasn't really so plain and simple, and wondered if there might be more to it. Mickey, Gideon remembered, had been a man with some charm. She'd always been good at changing the subject, so she reverted back to what he'd blurted out earlier in the kitchen. And you didn't kill anyone, Gideon. You can't look at it that way. You weren't there, Mom. And yes, I did. So don't. He disengaged, moved toward the veranda's steps. Where you going? Down to the beehive for a closer look. He had turned that direction when someone screamed. Like most sounds in the reach, the wind carried it, made it sound like it had come from every direction at once, until on the second scream Gideon pinpointed it. By the look on her face, Maxine did too. The tunnel, they said in unison. And then a siren started blaring. Chapter 22. Maddie. Before. Clarity was a double-edged sword. Maddie Boyle's mind and memory, for weeks now, had slowly been returning, bits and pieces from her childhood, and most recently her time in college before the attack. Despite what her parents had insisted, that she wait until next semester to go back, to not do too much too soon, she'd felt she was sound enough of mind to return to her fall classes at the College of Charleston right away. She was certainly physically ready, strong enough to run now. She'd done 3 miles this morning, but she'd feared the attention her walking into the classroom would bring. The stares, the questions she couldn't answer. Her awakening had been front-page news for 3 days. Charleston College student comes back to life, but school would be there when she returned. When she'd left home, she hadn't been as confident in her mission as she'd pretended to be with her mother. She knew where she needed to go. Harrods reached Nebraska. She knew who she needed to see, a young boy named Solomon Dupree. And she also knew he was a coma patient, but had been under for much longer than she had, and that he was important over there. The rest had begun coming back to her within hours of leaving home, and the memories of both her previous life and La La Land had come at her like a tsunami before she'd hit the South Carolina border. So hard and fast, she'd had to pull over on the emergency lane gravel and vomit as semi-trucks zoomed by. Waves of dizziness had forced her to take breaks at 3 different rest stops on the first day, until she'd ultimately decided to stop for a night on the north side of Atlanta to mentally regroup. And that night, despite the intense urgency she felt to reach Harrod's Reach, had turned into 3. She hadn't felt it was safe to drive, not with her mind fluttering so freely and without warning between reality and the memories of where she'd been, which was not only coming back in pieces during the day, but as nightmares when she slept. A Charleston detective named Phipps had called during her second day in Atlanta, leaving 2 messages, wanting to see what she remembered from that night at the Charleston harbor. Even though there'd been no more reports of attacks in the area since her attack, they knew the horseshoe rapist was still out there. They needed her help bringing him in. They understood her reticence, but would appreciate a few minutes of her time. Detective Phipps called again the next day, left another message. She would have loved to help, she'd told herself inside the hotel room as she drank coffee and watched the world go by outside. But that motherfucker's face, thank the Lord, was still a blur to her. Or at least it had been until her 3rd night in that hotel room, when the smell of his foul, rancid breath came back to her, while she'd been watching the news and eating carry-out Chinese. She'd eaten half of her shrimp fried rice when the stench hit her. Nausea sent her to bed early. That night she awoke sweating, having gone deep enough into sleep to bring back with her a nightmare. A nightmare where she'd been back in La La Land, and that's when she'd fully started to understand about that place. That was where everyone went briefly when they dreamed, when they had nightmares. They catch glimpses, and then they wake up and mostly don't remember. Because everyone has been to La La Land. Maddie, Sully had told her in her first days there. Only the strongest can stay. The rest of the world wakes up and goes about their days. But not you. You stayed for a time, and now you're back. Do what you need to do. Along with a clear picture of her attacker's face, she'd awoken in the hotel room that night with another name on her lips. Amy Shimp. Throughout the day, 4 more names had come to her, and she'd written those down as well. But by then, she'd already spent hours locating Amy Shimp, making phone calls and eliminating those she felt weren't her Amy, scrolling online before finally pinpointing a 7-year-old Amy Shimp in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who'd been comatose for 2 years. She'd been struck in the head by a foul ball during a Houston Astros baseball game, spending a month in intensive care in Houston before finally being transferred back home, prospects negative in terms of recovery. Maddie checked out of the hotel that next morning and hit the road, no longer suffering the bouts of dizziness and nausea that had come along with what she now called her memory dumps. She could stop by and see Amy on the way to Harrod's Reach. After a few miles, she'd thought, "Quit kidding yourself. You don't mean to just see her. You mean to take her with you." Not kidnap, thought Maddie as she sped west through Georgia, but convince the parents to let her go. At that point, Maddie's nerves started shredding for different reasons, because how in the hell could she convince 2 grieving parents that their deadhead daughter needed to go on a sudden trip? And deadhead? Where had that thought come from? It was heartless, and that wasn't her. Someone else called them that. Deadheads. Them, because there's more. Every name coming to you now, they're deadheads, Maddie, and they need you. They need you to get them before he gets them. A headache started behind her eyes, so she drove for the next few miles in quiet contemplation, no longer allowing herself to think of the big picture because the big picture right now was too big. Too much. Do your best to not sound like a lunatic and get to Amy Shimp before he does. On the road, she called Detective Phipps, and while he seemed pleased to hear from her, she kept it short and ended it abruptly when he suggested meeting in person. He was tall, she told him over the phone. 6'4" at least, and well over 250 pounds. She wondered all over again how in the hell she'd fought him off. His eyes were brown, dead, like there was no life in them. His face was doughy. His cheeks and neck were pockmarked, like he'd had bad acne as an adolescent. His hair was long, to the shoulders, uncombed and greasy. The detective had asked if that was all. She said, "That horseshoe he left on me. That wasn't the only one on him. I know what you guys call that, like a calling card or something, but it wasn't the only one on him." Even now as she drove, she remembered the way the horseshoes at his waist had jangled and clanked together during their struggle. You know how a janitor wears a bundle of keys off his belt? That's what the horseshoes made me think of. They just hung there, heavy and loud. She told the detective she had to go. She'd let him know if she remembered anything more, and no, it wasn't in her best interest to meet in person. Not right now. She drove the next several hours thinking of a plan, pondering what to say to the Shimps, trying to conjure up the resolve she'd need to even broach, "I need your daughter to come with me." The drive gave her ample time to think. Dreams might be fleeting, but this most recent memory dump from her time in La La Land stayed like an ingrained image. The lake of fire, the island of bones, the field of black roses, the forest of mare trees and the 3 backwards oceans, where pink birds soared large as condors, where monsters were as likely as the sunsets, and where everything dripped with vibrant, lurid color. What struck her odd now was that both Amy Shimp and Sully Dupree in La La Land were young adults, while they were still children here. Sully in his 1920s-style Applejack hat. Blue eyes bright and bold and confident. Skin, sun-touched and darkened by whiskers, but not enough to hide the inch-long scars at his chin and right cheekbone. His black shirt unbuttoned down to the middle of his muscled chest, rolled up at the elbows, revealing strong, ropey arms. Her first moments in La La Land, other than walking through the knee-high yellow grass, where purple snakes slithered through rich, moist soil and red spiders climbed up and down every distinct buttery yellow blade, had nearly been the end for her. which, Sully had told her, would have also spelled the end for her over here. She'd stumbled across a cluster of barbaric men sitting around a campfire, roasting meat on a spit, not animal meat, but a human arm being turned and charred and blackened. Beside the circle of men was a wheelbarrow full of body parts, arms, legs, feet, hands with stray fingers on the ground, resting there like giant maggots. The noise of her retching alerted the men, and two came sprinting up the hill toward her, one with a sword and the other with an axe. When they were no more than 10 feet away, as Maddie had stood too stunned to move, two gunshots echoed from behind her, and both men dropped dead. The ones below stood from the fire and ran off, leaving their wheelbarrow of body parts behind. She'd turned to find Sully behind her, handguns still smoking like they do in cartoons. He kicked one of the dead men with his scuffed brown boots and spoke in a deep, weathered voice. "We call them door runners. They scavenge the doors for severed limbs that get lopped off when the doors breathe." He squinted against the intense sunlight. "Not all of us are good over here." Maddie flexed her hands on the wheel as she drove, sure that she could still feel Sully's grip when, after saving her life over there, he'd shaken her hand, told her his name, and said in his deep, weathered voice, "Welcome to Lalaland." By the time she pulled into the Shimps' driveway in Tulsa and parked beside their modest ranch house, she had a carefully worded plan. But when she knocked on the door and waited, she grew nervous because this was stupid, so irrationally senseless that her palms had begun to sweat. And by the time the door was opened by a woman way too old to be the mother, Tammy Shimp, Maddie panicked. The woman stared. "Can I help you?" Maddie said, "Is Amy there?" Which had not been her plan of attack. "Is this a joke? Huh? A cruel prank? Or are you a reporter?" A younger voice sounded from an adjacent room. "Who is it, Mom?" That made sense, thought Maddie. This woman was her mother. Maddie's confidence grew. "Can I please talk to Tammy, Amy's mother?" "I know who Tammy is. Who you are is the question." "My name is Maddie Boyle, Mrs. Shimp." "I'm not Shimp." The woman glanced toward another room. "And I wish she wasn't anymore either. Jeffrey's long gone." This is awkward, but Amy, you see, I was like her." Just then Tammy Shimp showed herself in the doorway, smaller than her mother in height and in build, but on first impression mighty. Tammy was pretty like Maddie had seen in the papers, but older now, like a mother whose child needed around-the-clock care, and Maddie wanted to tell her that she knew all about it. She knew what it was like on the other side. That there was a link between Maddie and this woman's daughter she couldn't yet explain, only that it was as real as the sweat now gathering in her armpits. Tammy must have sensed the nerves. She placed a hand on her mother's shoulder to say without words, "I got this, you can go," and off her mother went, not pouting but certainly not trusting the stranger at the door. Tammy removed an earpiece and small headphones and apologized that she'd been on a call, that she worked from home. She reached out her hand like she was eager for company. That was what Maddie told herself to make herself feel better, to prep herself for the weird ask she was about to throw out to this total stranger. Only that her daughter Amy wasn't a stranger, and she was not a little girl where Maddie knew her. She shook Tammy Shimp's hand. "My name is Maddie Boyle. I'm a senior at the College of Charleston. Until 3 weeks ago I was—" Maddie trailed off when she saw how intently Tammy Shimp was watching her, and with pooling tears in her eyes. "Maddie, I know who you are," Tammy said. "Please come in." Chapter 23. Beth. Now, they needed more bodies in uniform. Beth had been on Grover about it for months. Another deputy, at least. Lump was useless, and she was green. In his old school way of doing anything, like a turtle out on a leisurely sunlit stroll across the forest, he'd say he'd look into it. God love you, Beth thought, as she sped toward the tunnel for the second time in 12 hours, siren blaring, but I'm pretty pissed off right now. Beth and Lump were basically it, the sheriff's department. Mrs. Rosa Downs, the last living relic from the old police department, handled all the processing and paperwork, but she was pushing 70 and forgetful. And their more experienced deputy, young talent named Matt Barnes, who'd been with Meeks for 4 years, up and left just over a year ago for a bigger job in Kansas. And there was no blueprint for this. This madness. They'd had no luck on the license plates Lump had run last night. Simon was still in his cell, and she'd yet to have time to question him further. According to Lump, Simon had done nothing but sleep since Beth had left, and was still asleep now, snoring when Mrs. Downs had taken the call 10 minutes ago from a hysterical Mrs. Dawson down at the tunnel. The phone call had woken Beth up after only a couple of hours of sleep. She left Jax's bed as quietly as she'd climbed into it, both her husband and son still sleeping. She freshened up at the sink and left within 5 minutes of getting the call. The flash of light she'd seen last night was at the forefront of her mind, what she'd thought to be a lightning strike, but now had her doubts. She pulled her car to a skidding stop on the grass overlooking the gully. Before she opened the door, her phone chimed with an incoming email from Brianna Bookman, responding to her inquiry from last night. She opened the email as she got out of the car and could tell by the length of it that it was pertinent. 3 weeks ago, a man in a Detroit, Michigan, suburb was found dead and beheaded on the back deck of his house. Beth looked away from the email long enough to navigate the downslope to the ravine, but once she hit level ground, she continued reading, with the severed head resting on his chest, the man's hands holding it in place. Hands, plural, Beth thought, which was only different than here because the body at the tunnel had one hand holding the hand of the other corpse, which strengthened her theory of 2 separate killers. Beth plowed on toward the looming tunnel. Sunlight glistened off weeds and saplings and stones wet with morning dew. Wisps of fog floated in front of her. Colorful leaves, still crisp from recently falling, kicked up with the breeze and spun cyclic in the air. She finished skimming Brianna's message. A week after the first beheading, these details were left out of the paper. Another beheaded body, this a 40-year-old woman from another Detroit area suburb, was found by her husband on their living room floor, holding her head in her hands, eyes open and facing the door as he walked in from work. These details leaked and have only recently been connected to the first beheading the week prior. Beth pocketed the phone, pulled her gun, and hurried toward the tunnel's southern entrance, where Kelly Dawson, who ran Harrod's Reach's most popular fire oven pizza joint, claimed to have seen a body. Some swore on crisp mornings they could hear the ghost roars of steam engines passing through the ravine. Beth heard birdsong, approaching sirens, and the thump of her own heartbeat. But what was Dawson doing down here? Too many residents still liked to do their morning runs through the woods, their morning hikes through the ravine, no matter how dangerous it was. And now what? The tunnel's entrance was visible 40 yards ahead, with a dozen people around it. Beth shouted, "Get back! Get back!" They watched as Beth approached with her gun raised. Grover's voice sounded in her head. "They'll follow you, Beth. They'll listen." This after Beth, on her first day with the badge, questioned why the town would follow the orders of such a young rookie deputy, a female in a male-dominated world. Because you're a leader since the night of your birth. She'd laughed, but he'd continued unabated. Since the night of that storm, Beth, people here have looked at you in. Don't say it. Ah, he'd said, with respect. Sully garnered that same respect, Beth. I am not Sully Dupree. Perhaps not, but you're cut from the same fearless cloth. Beth carefully navigated the brick rubble from the collapsed southern wall and saw what the people had surrounded. A chair, occupied by what looked like a body, sat in the shadows of the tunnel's opening. Someone was crying. They averted their eyes. A few glanced, but were quick to look away again. What the hell was sitting in that chair? It looked human, but at the same time not. It wasn't moving. Beth continued over the bricks, as she'd done last night under the cloak of darkness, but something about how this morning's sunlight mixed with the wisps of fog and morning dew made this seem more surreal and fantastical. Like something in the air was off. and there was no way to pinpoint it. That flash of light last night. She glanced at the chair, knew right off it was too much to take in all at once. Several of the bystanders cried out, talking in unison now that the law had arrived, some pointing at the chair while others pointed to the sky, where a large bird hovered 20 feet above the chair, its dark shadow the size of an albatross as it circled. Beth glanced at the body in the chair, what appeared to be a woman with long blonde hair falling past the shoulders in ringlets. Something about the rich color made her think of corn silk, made her think it was not real like a wig. But there was something wrong with the face as well. It looked clunky, like the skin had begun to peel off. The birds swooped down toward the small group. They ducked, shielded their faces as the bird flew back toward the sky. Justine Baker said, "Beth, what is that?" Beth looked up toward the bird's flight for a true study of the thing. Until then, she'd only glimpsed it, squinting through sunlight, assuming it was a hawk, except this was the size of a vulture, or perhaps larger, like a condor. But it was the color that struck her. The bird was as blue as if it had flown through a waterfall of azure paint, and the image immediately brought Beth back to what she'd seen inside Simple Simon's cottage the night before, to those oddly colored pelts and skins on his wall. Jane Bigsby, whose collapse on the gym floor last night had been the start of this never-ending nightmare, sat on the grassy incline with her face in her hands, sobbing. What was she doing down here? Beth looked to Justine Baker, who was rubbing Jane's back in comfort, and said, "Doc?" She mouthed the words. "Did he die?" Justine shook her head no. Jane lowered her hands from her face and stared at the odd chair at the tunnel's mouth. "Something's happening, Beth. Something's coming through." Travers was convinced of it. "There are some things at home you need to see." The blue bird swooped down again, and they all ducked. Beth aimed her gun at the bird, followed the flight path, until it retreated into the sky. She lowered her gun. A breeze blew a crisp, white leaf across the brick dust like a tumbleweed, and it snagged on Beth's left pant leg at the ankle. It was as large as a dinner plate, white with black and red veins. "Look at the trees, Beth," Jane hissed. He was so goddamn obsessed with this tunnel. Justine Baker locked eyes with Beth and nodded toward the tunnel's southern entrance. For the first time, Beth saw what Jane Bigsby was seeing, what all of them had already seen, not just the strange bird soaring and the doll-like body on the chair, but what had happened all around the mouth of the tunnel's stone rim. The ivy and climbing vines that covered the stones, typically lush and green, had turned colors, with hues of pink and white and purple and gold dominating the tunnel's arch, coiled and intertwined as vines do, but more noticeable now with the different colors. Beth heard movement behind her. The sirens had become background noise. The medics had arrived, along with Chimp Devers, Jax's boss from the fire department, and Gideon beside him. The medics stopped in their tracks, stared in awe. Chimp stopped too, his eyes pinging back and forth from the bird's flight to the tunnel. "What the fuck is going on?" Gideon moved toward where Beth stood. "The trees," said Gideon, like he too was ignoring what was in that chair. Beth looked from the colorful vines edging the stones around the tunnel to the trees in the woods that bordered it. The leaves had turned white on at least a dozen trees, those closest to the opening, not as large as the leaf that had clung to Beth's leg before skittering, breeze blown, down the ravine's gully, but similar in shape and texture. Because the other one had come from the tunnel. Carson Knox, the owner of Knox Plumbing, stepped from the cluster of people and pointed at Gideon. "It's him. Things all started when he came back to town." Beth glared. "Shut up, Knox." She kept her focus on the smattering of white-leaved trees. The large blue bird circled low over the chair, the swooping wingspan strong enough to displace air. Knox said, "Son of a bitch," and stepped back into a fighting stance. Beth aimed her gun again, followed the flight of the bird, which was low enough to see oily black feathers within all that blue. "Beth, look at the ground." Gideon pointed past the thing in the chair. Just outside the tunnel, are those shells? She allowed herself another glance at the thing in the chair as she followed Gideon's extended finger. Out from about 15 feet from the tunnel's entrance, the brick dust and rubble on the ground appeared to have been pushed back, cleared away from the tunnel toward where they all now stood in the ravine, extending a good 5 feet from the body in the chair. And the only thing Beth could envision was an ocean tide, because that thumbnail patch of ground outside the tunnel now looked like a beach littered with what the tide had brought in. Black branches and rocks of every color. At least 24 seashells, most of them light blue, were scattered about the ground, along with a dozen more fish that looked to be dead, with one in particular, over to the right, just in the grass, barely moving, slowly dying, and goddamn if a few blades of that grass hadn't turned the color of wheat. Chimp Devers gave the chair a wide gap as he rounded toward the seashells on the ground behind it. Beth said, "I wouldn't touch those, Chimp." But he did, just like a kid needing to touch a candle flame to truly believe it was hot. He held one up to his ear and listened. "It's the ocean." Raymond James called out, "There is no ocean in Herod's reach, Chimp." Chimp dropped the seashell to the ground, moved closer to the tunnel's entrance, and gestured to the shells all around him. "Then how do you explain this, Ray?" Carson Knox again pointed past Beth. "It's Gideon. I'm telling you, it's—" I said, "Shut your fucking face, Knox." As soon as Beth took 2 cautious steps toward the chair, the bird swooped down, squawking, landed on the back of the chair, next to where the lifeless head lolled toward the left shoulder. "Shoot it," Jane Bigsby screamed from behind. The bird's head rotated toward Beth, as if daring her to. 2 beady eyes dark as coal and glistening wet, fresh from whatever hell it had just come. Beth leveled the gun, said, "Fly away." She inched closer. "Fly away." The massive bird dug its hooked gray beak into the curls of blonde hair and started pecking, as if hunting for food. Beth inched close enough to see that the hair wasn't real, but a wig with fake corkscrew curls, and when she got closer still, she realized the odd-looking skin wasn't skin at all. But as soon as the bird's beak went for that fake skin and came back with a small swatch of cloth-like material and revealed a face behind it, the cheek of a face with whiskers, because it wasn't a woman, Beth fired. The bullet plugged the bird dead center and sent it skidding, back tumbling, beak over talons into the brick dust and dead fish and seashells. The wings still pulsed and fluttered. Beth couldn't take the screeching sounds coming from it, so she shot it again, this time spinning the bird back into the shadows of the tunnel in a puff of blue feathers and bird guts. "Motherfuck!" Knox shouted, covering his ears. Beth breathed heavily. Another white leaf whisked out from the tunnel. "Careful," Gideon said over her shoulder. And then, Jesus, as he must have just noticed what she'd noticed. The top cloth over the body's face, not just resting there over the nose and cheekbones and jawline, but sewn with red thread into the skin. The stitching like that of a threaded baseball, running from where flesh met the hairline in front of the ears and down into the neckline below the chin. The mouth was a hatched line of red crisscross stitches. Brown coat buttons acted as the eyes. Gideon stood next to her. They made him into a doll. A female doll. Beth stepped to within a couple of feet of the chair. The body had been dressed in a paisley summer dress, the V-shaped neckline revealing a fat chest that had recently been shaved. Because dolls don't have hair. The corpse's calves were shaved as well, the chubby feet shoved into a pair of blue pumps. Gideon moved around to the back of the chair to view the horror in full. Carson Knox stood near the entrance to the tunnel, touching the colorful vines around the edge. Beth shouted, "Knox, stop! Don't touch it." But he'd already plucked a foot-long strand of vine and was analyzing it inches from his face. She didn't trust it, just like she didn't trust Chimp now lifting a second seashell despite her earlier warning not to. "Put those down," she ordered them, and then focused on the human doll in the chair. The chubby hands rested casually on each bent knee, obviously positioned there. But those hands, she recognized those hands. No, it hit her hard and fast. She'd seen those hands last night inside the hospital waiting room. No. Beth, Gideon said, staring at something behind the chair. Chimp Devers nudged a dead orange fish with the toe of his boot and then picked up a third seashell, this one larger than the other two in his hands, and a deeper shade of light blue. Carson Knox plucked off another thread of pink and purple vine. "Stop," Beth screamed. "Don't touch anything. This is a crime scene." Deputy Lump finally arrived and echoed her. "Don't touch nothing." "Beth," Gideon watched her over the morbidly stitched human doll. "Look at this." Beth made her way around the chair to where Gideon pointed. It didn't appear that anyone else had realized it was Mayor Truffant under that hideous disguise. A piece of printer paper had been stapled to the back of his neck, a handwritten note that took up the entire page. No, not a note, but a message for sure. Beth squatted down for an eye-level read. "I left my baby lying here. Lying here, lying here. I left my baby lying there. To go and gather berries. I found the wee brown otter's track. Otter's track, otter's track. I found the wee brown otter's track. But ne'er a trace, oh my baby, oh, I found the track of the swan on the lake. Swan on the lake, swan on the lake. I found the track of the swan on the lake. But not the track of baby, oh, I found the trail of the mountain mist. Mountain mist, mountain mist. I found the trail of the mountain mist. But ne'er a trace of baby, oh." Beth nearly plucked the note from the body's neck, but remembered her own orders. It was all evidence. "It's a lullaby," she said to Gideon. "Not one I've ever heard." "Me either, but Jesus." "Beth, do you know who this is?" "Yes." She watched the tunnel, as if waiting for something to suddenly come out of it. She called Chimp over. She'd noticed he'd dropped the seashells from his hands. When Chimp got close enough, out of everyone else's earshot, Beth said, "I need you to get all your men, Chimp. Block every street leading in and out of the reach. Right now." "Yes, now. Do it last night. Do it yesterday. Blockade the roads. Nobody gets in or out. We're not officers of the law, Beth. Right now, we all are. Go on, but without too much commotion." Chimp started off but stopped, nodded toward the chair. "You know who's under that?" "I do," she said calmly, just for his ears. "It's Mayor Truffant." Chimp tightened his jaw like he might explode. Chimp played poker with Mayor Truffant once a month at the parish rectory with Father Fred. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Beth said, "but do your grieving in your car, not here. Go on now. Act like you don't know." Chimp hesitated at first, but then got a move on. A few others from the crowd followed him. Beth ordered everyone else gone and then fired a shot into the air to reinforce it. Knox gave her lip, eyed Gideon like he still believed him to be at fault, but moved along with the herd. Beth watched them go, glad, despite all of Gideon's history of being chicken shit, that he hadn't gone with them. Gideon said, "Beth, what's going on?" "I don't know, but the two bodies found last week have yet to be identified. They're not from here." She stared at the chair. "But now they've gotten one of our own." "I don't think it's one person," Beth said. "Might even be looking at 3 now. And I think they're still here in the reach." She faced the tunnel, the ground leading up to the dark entrance littered with things that had no earthly right being there. But the way Mayor Truffant's body had been left outside the tunnel. Gideon said, "What are you thinking?" Beth eyed the note, the weird lullaby written on it, and then looked deep into the tunnel again. "That it's a sacrifice of some sort." "For what?" "I don't know." Chapter 24. Teddy. Before. It was Brandy's idea to take a detour from the list and go see Teddy's mother in Virginia. Teddy had warned her they had places to go and dead heads to kill, but Brandy had been adamant. And with how deeply she'd gotten her claws into him, he couldn't say no. Good thing all her ideas had turned out to be good ones. Everyone else on the Lullaby Express was afraid of her. Ever since that day in the rest area bathroom when she'd stroked his horns 5 inches now and starting to sprout new branches, she'd insisted everyone on the bus call her the Black Widow. One man who they'd picked up in Pennsylvania, a really twitchy fucker who was on the run, he claimed for doing something bad, real bad, refused to call her that, and now he was no longer alive, his body dumped in rural Ohio, having bled out all over one of the Lullaby Express's seats after Brandy's knife entered his brain stem from the underside of his chin. Ever since that, everyone on the bus up to 12 now respectfully called her the Black Widow. Teddy pulled the Lullaby Express to a stop outside his childhood home and said, "You sure you want to do this?" Brandy stood up and yelled to the passengers, "Nobody gets off. You understand what I'm saying?" Some nodded, but others didn't. She said to Teddy, "Turn that shit down." He'd been playing lullabies on repeat over the speakers he'd put in. The lullabies seemed to calm a few of them when they got antsy. He turned it down. It had been playing the Haitian lullaby, Dodo Titi, another ditty where the baby would come to harm if they didn't go to sleep. Brandy repeated herself to the passengers and got all nods this time. Satisfied, she opened the door and said to Teddy, "Let's go." Teddy stood from the driver's seat and his horns hit the ceiling. Bolts of pain shot down through his skull. He reached to the dashboard for the cowboy hat he'd been wearing to hide them, but Brandy said, "No, leave it. Let her see you as you are." Teddy left the hat on the dash and thought she ain't gonna see shit. She's practically a dead head herself, but followed Brandy to the front door. It was unlocked, which meant the old widow from next door, Mrs. Chastain, was here helping her eat. Once inside, they found Mrs. Shree Chastain standing in the living room beside Belinda Lomax's hospital bed, but instead of her typical drugged-out gaze, Mother was sitting up on her own and seemed more alert than she had in a year or more. Mother turned her head toward them, but after seeing his horns, her smile faded. Mrs. Chastain gasped, stepped away. "Hello, Theodore." She spoke in pleasantries, but his horns had spooked her. Not only the horns, but perhaps what Brandy was wearing as well. "Mother," said Teddy, and then to their neighbor, Mrs. Chastain. Brandy stared at Belinda Lomax just as his mother stared into her. Not so much in a bad way, thought Teddy, but more out of curiosity. And then the most shocking thing occurred. Mother reached out her hand toward Brandy, and Brandy stepped closer and grasped it lovingly like they somehow understood each other, when Teddy had assumed that Brandy would have been the last woman on earth of whom Mother would have approved. But here they were, not only holding hands but smiling. Brandy said to Mrs. Chastain, "You can go now." Mrs. Chastain hesitated long enough for Mother to say, "Go on, Margaret." And then her eyes turned cold. Teddy saw hate flash through them, which he'd seen glimpses of before, but never toward Mrs. Chastain. "I know you've been wearing my jewelry, Margaret, wearing my clothes." Mrs. Chastain paused but wouldn't look back toward her friend on the bed. Mother said, "I know you've been stealing cookies from my cookie jar." Something about the way Mother smiled made Teddy wonder if she was really talking about cookies. "But that's okay, Margaret," said Mother, grinning. "I used to have relations with Stan." Mrs. Chastain closed her eyes like she might get sick, or maybe closing them could block out what Mother was saying about her dead husband. But Mother wasn't finished. "Every Monday and Friday morning," she said, "for years." Jesus Christ, thought Teddy. Who was this woman? Mrs. Chastain stormed out, but not before giving Teddy's horns one last look. The screen door slammed shut. Belinda Lomax looked at Teddy. "I'm tired of fighting it, Theodore. So goddamn tired." Teddy stood speechless. Never had he heard his mother take her Lord's name in vain. This wasn't the mother who'd raised him. Wasn't the mother he'd expected Brandy to meet. Wasn't the mother who'd constantly gotten so under his skin he'd tried to kill her. Tired of fighting what, he thought. Mrs. Chastain started screaming outside. Brandy let go of Mother's hand to look out the window. Oh shit. "What?" asked Teddy. The guy with the axe got off the bus. Brandy headed for the front door, hurried out, shouting, "Put her down." Teddy heard Mrs. Chastain screaming, and then she stopped. Brandy gasped loud enough for Teddy to hear her through the wall. Teddy moved toward the window, pulled the curtains aside. Mrs. Chastain's body lay in the grass a few paces away from the bus. The big, beefy son of a bitch with the axe was stepping back onto the Lullaby Express, mission accomplished, blood dripping from the blade he liked to sharpen as they drove. The bus shook under his weight. Teddy didn't know his name because the man didn't talk much. He'd been the third passenger Teddy had picked up, weeks ago in the Detroit area, and maybe this outburst had been brewing for some time. Brandy had warned that the man seemed to be getting fidgety and more anxious by the day, like he badly needed to use that axe on something, on someone. Teddy looked back to Mrs. Chastain's body on the grass. The man had lopped her head clean off and placed it on her chest, eyes open and facing the road. Teddy should have been horrified, but the tingle inside his skull made him feel otherwise. From the tip of his horns on down to his toes, he felt the thrum. Fuel coursed through his blood and bones and gave him a jolt. Brandy turned toward him at the window and held out her hands like, "What the fuck?" Teddy thought, maybe we shouldn't have turned the lullabies down so low. He gave Brandy a look that said, "You handle it," and then turned back toward his mother. Belinda Lomax looked tired. She held a yellow paper out to Teddy. "Margaret got this out of the mail." Teddy grabbed the paper from his mother. She said, "Take me there." Before he could read what was on the yellow paper at first glance, it looked like a flyer of some sort. Brandy came storming back inside. Brandy had a temper and Teddy liked it. Teddy told her, "Take her around back. Bury it." "We're gonna burn it first," she said. "Who's we?" "Freddie, the dude with the black greasy hair and the lisp. Like Elmer Fudd. Sits 2 benches behind your driver's seat." "Elmer Fudd doesn't have a lisp, he stutters," said Teddy. "You're thinking Sylvester, although I think he does that on purpose." "Whatever," said Brandy. "We picked him up in Kalamazoo, right after you did that dead head in Saginaw." She gestured toward the window. "He just walked off the bus and said his name was Firestarter Freddie." She scratched her head like she was annoyed with all of it. And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, I start fires. That's what I do." Except he said it with that lisp. "Bring it in here," whispered Mother Lomax. The body, burn it all down, and Teddy thought, now we're talking, just let me get a few things from my room first. He said to Brandy, "Tell Freddie to bring the body in here. Get that weirdo with the horseshoes to help carry it." Brandy rolled her eyes. He said, "It was your idea to come here." And that got her moving, albeit with major attitude and some bounce to her rump, barely concealed by that black miniskirt. Finally, he looked at the yellow paper his mother had handed him when she'd said, "Take me here." It was a flyer advertising the grand reopening of the historic Beehive Hotel in some place called Harrod's Reach, Nebraska. At first, Teddy thought, "No way, no how, Mother," but then the name Harrod's Reach struck him like a church bell. Harrod's Reach was where he'd been heading to before this detour, where the most recent name on his list resided. Some deadhead named Solomon Dupree. Goes by Sully. Chapter 25. Gideon. Now, inside the Harrod's Reach Sheriff's Department, Gideon stood side by side with the 4 others about to be deputized. Next to him were Nurse Natalie, Fire Chief Chimp Devers, Fireman Jax McBride, and Joseph Farrington, the editor of the Harrod's Reach Gazette. Now that word had spread about Mayor Truffan's murder, it was like a hornet's nest had been shaken and the residents were ready to sting. Joe said there were more hoping to join. Beth looked eerily calm as she paced before the 4 of them, churning out some deputizing words she must have just Googled or was making up on the spot. Gideon quivered when she put on his badge. The night before he'd left town had been an unexpectedly memorable one. Beth had known Gideon had had a thing for her since he was a little boy. As young children, when she should have been too young to understand the transformation of his face because of his cleft upper lip, the surgeries and bandages he'd had to wear for weeks, until finally all that was left was the scar. She never pointed at it, never made him feel small because of it. Like she knew underneath it all his face was healing, becoming something improved. During adolescence, Gideon's feelings for her painfully blossomed, as did his anxiety. The girls in middle school snickered about what it might feel like to kiss his lip. That scar, while Beth doubled down on beauty and perfection, and a bravery Gideon could only pretend to know. But Beth and Jax, by their teens, had become inseparable, almost like they'd made a secret pact. Gideon and Beth had had their moments, just frequently enough to make Gideon think he might have a chance, but too often Giddy-up Gideon was the third wheel, which had made what she'd done the night before his deployment more jarring, slipping into his bedroom like she'd done, but even then she hadn't kissed him. Focus, Gideon. People are getting murdered. Focus on the badge now pinned to your shirt. Beth looked over her shoulder at Simon, still asleep on his cot inside cell #1, and thanked him for being the witness at their official swearing in. Simon had his shoes on the wrong feet. Gideon wondered if he even counted as a witness since he was asleep and technically under arrest. And what was that giant orange book tucked in his arms like a teddy bear? Thick with pages and loose papers, the size of a photo album Gideon's mother used to make before Sully went down. And what in the hell was La La Land, which it said on the front cover? Jax, Joseph, and Natalie funneled out the door to the sunlit street. Gideon hung back because Beth did. She stood at Simon's cell and said, "I've half a mind to wake him up." "He been sleeping this entire time." "Pretty much," she said. "Must sleep a lot at home, too. Living room's practically all bed." She unlatched keys from her belt, unlocked Simon's cell door, and started inside toward where he slept. She said to Gideon, "You go on. Your post is on Mallard, right?" "Yeah." But Gideon didn't budge. Didn't feel right leaving Beth inside here alone with this man. "Always the gentleman," she said in jest, but she didn't complain when Gideon stepped inside the cell with her. She bent down, nudged Simon's shoulder, once, twice, and then hard the third time, but he didn't so much as break stride with his snoring. "Simon." She nudged him again. "Simon," she called, louder this time, before making a play for the orange book in his arms. "What are you doing?" asked Gideon. "What's it look like?" The book's spine faced down toward the mattress, situated so that she was able to pry it open in the middle, just enough to see most of one page at a time. The one she stopped on was full of color and featured a massive, creepy brown dog with sharp fangs and evil eyes. Below it, Simon had written, "Passanta, Catalan folklore, presence brings about nightmares." Then she carefully flipped to another page. The two of them craned their necks to better see the page, which showed another beast, brown and black and gray, that looked like a hodgepodge animal. Below it he'd written, "The Baku, Japanese folklore, the Dream Eater." Gideon would have had to move Beth out of the way to see what had been written below that. "What's the rest say?" Beth hunkered lower, her face inches from the page and too close to Simon's body for comfort. "They eat nightmares, and if the nightmares they eat aren't bad enough, they'll eat your soul. Says here, God created all the animals, and the Baku is made up of all the spare pieces and parts." She started to turn another page, and the book shifted. Simon grunted, tugged it closer to his chest, and practically rolled over on it. Gideon said, "What do you make of it?" "Of him sleeping so much." "And the book?" "I don't know." She checked her watch. "But we've got work to do." Gideon took that as his cue to beat feet, and outside he saw Jax across the street in an animated discussion with another fireman, Rick Dugan. The two broke apart when Gideon saw them. Rick headed off toward his fire truck. Gideon felt Jax's eyes on him as he walked on, probably wondering why he'd spent that extra time inside with his wife. Gideon told himself to quit being paranoid, but had half a mind to ask Jax why he wasn't already at his post at the barricade crossing Guthrie Street. Natalie was in charge of anything at the hospital. Joe Farrington had the beat at Jefferson and Taylor Streets. The good thing about Harrod's Reach being bordered on one side by the forest and lake, and on another by the tunnel and one side mountain, was that there weren't many ways in and out of town. Gideon was quick to volunteer for the post at Mallard because of its proximity to the Beehive Hotel, so he could spy on the goings-on there. The town had grown quiet since Mayor Truffant was found earlier in the morning. Most had locked themselves inside their homes, their places of business. By the time Gideon made it to Mallard Street, he saw Beth's sheriff's cruiser idling next to the Smite house. She must have wasted no time after Gideon had left. Beth got out and ushered her 2-year-old son Brody to the wrap-around front porch. Gideon's mom, still in her bright yellow Beehive Hotel t-shirt, greeted them at the front door. She and Beth exchanged words and Beth jogged back to her car. What were they doing? Maxine and Brody waved to Beth from the porch as she reversed the car and headed toward Mallard at the same time Gideon walked past the driveway. He continued up Mallard toward the Beehive Hotel. Hammering echoed through the pines. White clouds hovered through a blue sky so pretty it was insane to think how ugly things were now beneath it. Gideon thought it was odd for his parents to be watching Brody, and he couldn't shake the feeling he'd had last night that Jax's presence in the Smite house hadn't been a one-off. That he, Gideon, had been the visitor inside his own home and not his childhood nemesis. And the tears. Gideon had never seen Jax cry. Beth claimed she'd seen it on the few occasions Jax, as a boy, had run away to her house after being beaten by his father, Tom, and another time as a teen when Jax, in a panic, had knocked on Grover Meeks's door, looking for Beth and needing somewhere to hide, needing a place to lie low from his father for a while. They'd assumed Jax had meant hours, but a while meant days. 4, in fact, before Grover had convinced the boy to return home, where ultimately Jax got beat up again. After that, Grover had laced his boots, pinned on his badge, placed the trademark bowler hat on his head, and had one foot out the door with his sidearm holstered before Jax grabbed the sheriff's arm to hold him back, pleaded with him to not make things worse. Grover agreed, but swore if he ever saw another mark on that boy's body from that son of a bitch father of his, he was throwing Tom McBride behind bars and swallowing the key. Everyone in town knew Tom McBride was not only a mean drunk who liked to put a hand to his wife and only son, but a bigot and a racist who'd been mumbling ever since Grover put on the star badge. That uppity sheriff wouldn't last 2 weeks in Harrod's Reach. Not only had the sheriff, to Tom McBride's chagrin, lasted 2 weeks, but his tenure now was best counted in decades, with Jax McBride a bully in his own right, the first one in line to vote for him every time Grover came up for re-election. Gideon strolled past the Beehive and imagined it suddenly imploding. That renovation should belong to his father and not some upstart, out-of-town wannabe. Gideon recalled the realtor years ago sitting in their living room, making his sales pitch on the Beehive to Mom and Dad, how he'd thought it strange the realtor looked too young to be selling historic hotels. And now she was working for him. Gideon paced behind the barricades across Mallard Street. Harrod's Reach had seen its share of violence, but never anything like this. Violence begetting violence like it was contagious. Like what Beth had briefly explained to him right before the swearing-in, her working theory of what she called cluster violence. Bottom line, the tunnel was coming alive. Gideon wondered what Sully would have thought about the tunnel right now, doing what it was doing, blooming. There was no other way for him to describe it. And here were the construction workers at the Beehive going about their business like someone hadn't just been stitched into a human doll 2 miles away. From where Gideon patrolled, the back of the Beehive was visible. Hammering sounded. A worker sawed through boards in the back parking lot. A trio of painters strolled in, held the door as an electrician walked out. Perhaps their obliviousness made sense. They were out-of-town contractors with jobs to do, but to Gideon that alone made them the first people he'd talk to. Beth had enough on her plate, so as soon as his shift was over, he'd do just that, interrogate each worker and find out if any had a fetish for making dolls. The hotel was looking good. He couldn't deny it. Not only had Mickey French taken over his father's idea, he was doing a bang-up job of it. Gideon had seen plenty of pictures of the beehive from its golden days. When he blurred his vision and imagined it sepia or black and white, it could have been plucked right from the newspapers that had once made it famous. On one of the tours of the beehive Archie had been given years ago, he'd found an old 1920s beige Applejack hat and Mickey had told him to keep it. He kept it and washed it, and eventually Sully started wearing it. Gideon could envision his little brother now, walking inside the beehive in that hat like he owned the place. He had walked all over town in that hat, like he owned the town. Now that hat, which Sully was clutching in his right hand when they'd found him in the tunnel that day, was hanging on the parlor wall above his bed. Gideon felt sure Sully would have loved the hotel every bit as much as he'd loved wearing that hat. The hotel's exterior courtyard had been given a proper facelift, with newly fashioned gazebos and stone walkways, fancy tables with umbrellas, trellises with climbing vines, and new wrought iron fencing to surround it all. It was quaint, lovely. He could see why his mother was so enamored. A curtain moved in a third-floor room. At first Gideon wondered why someone would be up there a month from the grand reopening, but of course each room had to be readied too. Could have been a painter, could have been someone hammering in a new baseboard or hanging the curtain itself. But Gideon couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. Quit being paranoid, soldier. But someone had snuck into their home last night and had attempted to abduct Sully. Someone had pulled the tube from his throat and unhooked him from the machines. It was hard not to be paranoid out here, to be untrusting of any strangers. A cloud moved and the sun showed itself again, glistening off something in the woods beyond the courtyard and forcing Gideon to squint. He stepped aside so it didn't strike him directly. It was a mirror. A large side mirror from a red bus. Not bright red, but more like the color of rust or dried blood. It wasn't hidden in the woods, but parked far enough back into the shadows to easily be missed. Gideon made a mental note to check that out too. Growing impatient, he started down the grassy slope toward the courtyard when a vehicle in the distance turned onto Mallard Street from the highway. Once it neared, he saw it was a minivan. A minute later it slowed, came to a stop outside the barricade, and honked repeatedly like they were having an emergency. Gideon hurried back up the slope toward the street, saw at least two people in the van, both women. The driver rolled down her window. She was dark-haired, 30s maybe, and looked tired with life. She said to Gideon, "Is something going on?" Gideon didn't mean to laugh, but he was nervous. Because things never change. Giddy up, Gideon. And to answer her question, there was a whole shit ton going on, but where to even start? He said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to. We're in the middle of a..." He noticed the young woman in the passenger's seat and went tongue-tied. "Middle of a lockdown," he stammered. The passenger was younger than the driver, lower 20s probably, and fit. And as soon as they locked eyes, he felt himself go red. "God damn it, soldier." Gideon closed his eyes, fought that voice away, opened them. "There's been a tragedy. This is Herod's Reach, right?" "Yes, ma'am," Gideon said to the passenger. "What brings you to town today?" The passenger undid her seat belt, leaned over the center console. This is going to sound strange, but... And now it was her turn to feel tongue-tied. This was a new sensation for Gideon, being on the other end of uncomfortableness. She glanced toward the back seat, and for the first time Gideon noticed a third passenger. A young girl lay across the minivan's bench, covered in a blanket and hooked to portable machines. Gideon had to look away. The girl reminded him too much of Sully, both in age and condition. The passenger found her words, "We're here to find Solomon Dupree." Goes by Sully. He's 8 years old. He's in... I know Sully. Gideon felt blood rush from his face. He could see relief washing over both women. How far had they come to get here? I'm his brother. The passenger gestured toward the driver. "This is Tammy Shimp. That's her daughter Amy in the back. We have a message for your brother. Could you take us to him, please?" "My brother, I know." Obviously stressed over trying to explain the situation, she touched her forehead, closed her eyes for a second to regroup, and tried again. "I know his situation. A month ago, I was in a coma. It's not so much a verbal message, but sorry. Don't be." Gideon had already begun moving one of the barricades. "I don't even know where to begin." "How about with your name?" said Gideon, and it had come out as smoothly as melted butter, despite the strange circumstances, and it had made her smile. "Mattie Boyle," she said calmly. "Gideon," he said. "Gideon Dupree." He nodded toward the Smite house in the distance. "Follow me." Chapter 26. Mattie. Now. Mattie was relieved now that she'd made it inside the town's perimeter. She and Tammy waited in the van as Gideon hustled inside to talk to his parents. She hadn't tagged him as one to still be living at home, but then again, technically, so was she. She hadn't given thought to what Sully Dupree's home would look like, but she hadn't envisioned this Victorian monstrosity, done up with all the bells and whistles of historical accuracy. It even had a name carved into a wooden sign in neat calligraphy letters, the Smite House. Like the big hotel she'd glimpsed at the top of the road, the Beehive, this house had sophistication and charm all the way up from the columned veranda to the dormers and gables, the pitched roofs and flanking turrets. Gideon exited the front door and hurried down the steps to the driveway. She wondered what he'd done to cause that limp. Something about that scar above his lip made him immediately handsome. He carried himself with a weird bashful confidence she'd never seen before in a man, so she found herself wishing he'd look up more. Just before he reached her rolled-down window, the front door of the Smite house opened, and out came an attractive middle-aged woman in a bright yellow t-shirt and holding a toddler who mimicked her wave. Mattie awkwardly waved back, wondering what Gideon had told the woman she assumed was his mother to make her so welcoming, so quickly. "Come on in," Gideon said with a smile. "Really?" "Yeah, do you need a wheelchair or something?" "No, I don't think so. We carried her to the car." Tammy Shimp was already out of the van and opening the hatch. Gideon opened the side door as Mattie hopped out and analyzed the best way to get the girl inside. Getting Amy and her essential equipment into the van with just the two of them had been a chore. At least Tammy's mother wasn't here pleading for them to rethink moving a comatose child across multiple states in a non-medical vehicle. To which Tammy had finally screamed at her mother, "Please shut up, this is my daughter." And then, "You saw her in there? Don't tell me you didn't see her, Mom." Thinking of it now brought tears to Maddie's eyes all over again, enough for Gideon to put a hand on her shoulder and ask if everything was okay, and she nodded. Like maybe now that they were here things would start to be okay. But the way Amy's heart rate had instantly risen back in Tulsa when Mattie had entered their house and mentioned the name of Sully Dupree, had that not been something akin to a miracle? And then what happened next, when Mattie sat on the poor girl's bed and whispered Sully's name a second time for that slight smile to emerge? That had been all Tammy Shimp had needed to see. She'd been quick to allow Mattie into her home because she'd seen the news on her phone. College of Charleston Senior suddenly awakens from 8-day coma. She'd read the article numerous times, she'd told Mattie, praying the same might eventually happen to her daughter. And now here they were, preparing to take her inside this stranger's home to see the boy in person. Tammy looked pale and was physically trembling. Mattie had warned her not to get her hopes up, that she didn't yet know what any of this meant. This might not work at all. But Tammy had wanted to do it anyway. They'd come this far. What else was there to lose? Gideon stood outside the open sliding door with his arms out. Together, Tammy and Mattie took Amy, still hooked up to the machines, and rested her carefully in Gideon's arms, at which point he proceeded toward the house like he was holding a loved one of his own. He walked carefully up the porch steps. Gideon's mother, still holding the toddler, opened the screen as wide as it would go, allowing Gideon to carry the child in sideways, with Maddie and Tammy in tow. The mother held a hand over her mouth like she might get emotional, but tears had already pooled in her eyes. Gideon, once inside the extravagant foyer, said, "Coming through," and then entered a hallway to the right, where a man she assumed to be Gideon's father appeared, quickly picking up tools from the floor and placing them inside an adjacent room. He was sweating, wiping his brow, and looked at his son with confusion. "Coming through," Gideon said again. His father backpedaled as they approached, showing them the way past this room and that room, and then a beautiful, airy old farmhouse-style kitchen Maddie wanted to revisit once things got settled. The father looked over his shoulder, turned as the hallway turned. "This way," he said, eyes on Amy's body resting limply in Gideon's arms. "I'm Archibald Dupree," he said to the strangers. "Call me Archie, and who do we have here?" Gideon answered, "This is Amy Shimp, her mother Tammy, and their friend Maddie Boyle. I explained it all to Mom. Just clear the way to Sully. I'll need somewhere to put her until we find another bed." "Of course," said Archie, turning and hurrying forward now. "Of course, just this way." He took them into a parlor with tall windows, a taller ceiling, and a hospital bed that seemed to swallow the little boy in the middle of it. Gideon said, "Dad, move him over." Archie rounded the bed and moved his son over as delicately as Gideon was handling Tammy's daughter. Gideon eased the little girl down on the bed, and Tammy followed right behind with the essentials. Archie was quick to clear off an end table and carry it around so that Tammy could place whatever devices she needed to on it. By then, Gideon's mother was inside the room with them with a toddler, who was pointing at the bed and saying, "Sully, that's Sully." And then, "Who's she?" Maddie laughed, but everyone's focus stayed on the two coma patients on the bed. Tammy looked like she might throw up. Archie looked pale and on the verge of getting sick too. Gideon was the only one in the room who appeared calm. Because what now? What really had they been expecting? For both children to suddenly wake up and ask what was for dinner. The longer they stood there and watched and waited, the more it all seemed painfully futile and stupid, like a big fucking waste of time. Tammy had started crying like she knew it too. But just as Mom Dupree, probably sensing things might soon turn south, had begun to take the toddler out of the room, Sully's right hand twitched. Archie Dupree gasped. He covered his mouth when Sully's hand twitched a second time. While everyone stood speechless, Gideon approached the bed. He leaned over his little brother's chest. "Sully, this is your brother, Gideon. There's someone in the bed beside you. Someone you might know." He looked to Maddie and Tammy. Maddie nodded to confirm, and even though she wasn't the girl's mother, she stepped toward the other side of the bed and hovered over Amy. "Amy, I know you know Sully's name. He's with you now. He's right beside you. If you can hear me." She trailed off when Amy's left hand twitched, inches away from Sully's right. Tammy Shimp said, "Oh my God." Archie was recording it on his phone. Maddie held out both hands for everyone to temper themselves. Don't expect too much. Don't expect anything more than what was happening now. "Sully," said Gideon, looking over the bed toward Maddie, which she took as a prompt to then say Amy's name again. "Amy, baby, we're right here," Maddie said. "Sully is right beside you." Sully's hand twitched again, and then moved an inch toward Amy's extended fingers. Mom Dupree behind Maddie said, "Holy shit." Amy's hand responded to Sully's proximity again, scooting closer to his fingers. Sully's hand responded, this time prodding her fingers, gripping them until they held hands, palm to palm, and everyone inside the parlor was holding their breath. Maddie and Gideon locked eyes over the bed, like they didn't know what had just happened, but for now, job well done. The two comatose children on the bed, still dead to the world, kept alive by the tubes and machines they were connected to, held hands like they'd never let go, and goddamn, Maddie thought, if they weren't both now slightly grinning. Only then did she remember the connection between the two in Lalaland. Chapter 27. Beth. Now, Beth had always prided herself on being fearless. It was a tag her parents had put on her early and often as a little girl, and the town had been quick to adopt. When Beth was 2, when most children were afraid to get into the town pool, Beth got a running start and jumped in. At 5, at an amusement park a town over in Crudup's Reach, she rode every roller coaster, sat easily upon every ride. She was on a bike without training wheels at age 4, staying at home by herself for the first time at age 7. At 8, she and Gideon and Jax had been throwing a football around the lawn of her backyard, and a stray throw by Gideon sent the football to land in the neighboring yard, home to a Rottweiler Beth's dad had more than once threatened to shoot. Gideon and Jax shook their heads, each pointing for the other to jump the fence and get it, only to find that Beth had already done so and was casually approaching where the dog stood growling, watching her almost as ferociously as she was watching it. And there was the tunnel, the infamous town landmark Beth had run through on a dare at age 5. When kids ignored the family rules and played down there outside the south entrance, she was the first to run in to retrieve whatever ball or frisbee was accidentally tossed or kicked into the dark void. She'd first kissed Jax McBride inside the tunnel, knowing right then and there that she'd marry him but never really love him. Like Sully Dupree years later, the tunnel had never scared her. The stories of it had never been a deterrent. In fact, more than not, she found herself drawn to it. If she was close, she felt the urgent need to go inside, even as an adult, which was why, even though Jax had begged her repeatedly to take someone with her, she was approaching the tunnel's south entrance alone, the second time this morning. Mayor Truffan's body had been removed. The body, still with the dollish cloth material stitched into the mayor's face and the creepy lullaby attached to the back of his neck, was resting inside the hospital morgue, inside the third and final cadaver freezer they had, the first 2 occupied by the bodies found 3 days ago. Those 2 bodies were the reason she'd returned to the tunnel. She'd be neglecting her duty if she didn't go check more thoroughly the area where those bodies had been found. She and Grover had taken pictures. They'd taped off the perimeter, but now she questioned whether they'd gone wide and far enough. And the condition of the bodies had left them both so heartsick, it was possible they'd overlooked something. Now, with the latest calling card left on Mayor Truffant, she was hoping for something to link the 3 murders. Instead of walking around the tunnel to the crime scene, which was what Jax had begged her to do, she was fixing to walk right through it. Because she couldn't not walk through it, not after what had bloomed from it overnight. You don't have to be so tough, Jax had said. She'd laughed at her comeback to Jax. It's not toughness if it comes naturally. If it goes without thinking, it often meant barreling straight into a thing. The chair Mayor Truffant's body had been fastened to had left 4 indentations in the brick dust. She'd put on gloves earlier to bag and tag samples of the fish and seashells that had been washed in with the tide. But what tide? What ocean? The only thing she could see on the far side of the tunnel was the fallen brick rubble and sunlit woods beyond. What they hadn't bagged and tagged, they'd left on the ground at the tunnel's entrance, and it appeared the fish left behind, while still colorful, had begun to lose their sheen, as if they'd indeed been alive when they'd first washed in but had died and were slowly decaying. Unlike the seashells, unlike the stark white leaves on the dozens of trees they now dotted, unlike the pink and purple and gold vines covering the stones around the tunnel's arch. Her phone showed no service. She'd missed a call from Gideon. She turned her phone on video, navigated the patch of ground where the dozens of seashells lay scattered, and entered the tunnel's south entrance. The temperature change was instant, but it wasn't the typical drop in temperature. Instead, it felt hotter, more humid. She kept the video running and turned on her cell phone's light to help guide her through the dark. She could see enough light on the north end to give her perspective. The scattering of seashells and dead fish hadn't been limited to the ground outside the tunnel. The inside was littered with them, too. The breeze brought with it a hint of the sea. For a few paces, she closed her eyes as she walked, and the sounds around her were magnified. The breeze whistled. Water dripped from the ceiling. A bird cawed. Rodents and animals scurried through the shadows. She opened her eyes, focused straight ahead. A white leaf skittered across the ground, blew past her. It was the same tunnel, but something didn't feel right. It shouldn't be hot in here. She should not be hearing ocean waves. And even more distant voices. She walked on, filming. Her pace quickened near the halfway point of the tunnel. Sunlight glared through the northern entrance, the right lower portion still blighted by the mound of bricks blocking it, where Doc Bigsby had been working with his wheelbarrow. If only she could question him. If only she knew what had happened that night. What had he seen or heard or felt before having his leg and arm severed? Suddenly, she saw the silhouette of a large deer standing atop the mound of brick rubble, backlit by sunlight. A massive animal with a huge set of antlers. The woods of Harrod's Reach were full of white-tailed deer, but this was the largest she'd ever seen. It seemed to be watching her. She slowly approached it. The deer got spooked and sprinted off. Beth ran after it. She searched for the sturdiest spots for footing atop the bricks and kept her eyes on the surrounding woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of the massive deer again. And there it was, 20 yards to the right of the tunnel's entrance, as if waiting for her. Standing roughly where the first two murdered bodies had been found by Simon Bowles, right in the center of the taped-off crime scene perimeter. But that wasn't what had Beth's heart in full gallop. The size of the deer, yes, and those antlers, yes, but the color the deer was black as tar, and the antlers were as red as fresh paint. It was a deer, but it wasn't. Beth did her best to hold her phone steady as she filmed it, and at the same time move closer, down from her view atop the fallen bricks, and now eye level with the animal. "Where do you come from?" she whispered. The deer's head rotated toward her. The eyes were a stark white compared to the rest of it. It made a noise like a snort and took 2 steps toward her, the feet as large as horse hooves. It should have been too warm to see crystallized breath, but that's what came out when it snorted again. Like the warm here was cooler than this thing had come from. Beth thought it wasn't of this earth. Even still, she slowly moved toward it, filming, now within 20 feet, 15, and then 10. The deer lowered his head, as if sniffing the forest floor, the area where those 2 bodies had forced the leaves flat days ago. Beth was close enough now to see swirls of orange within the red of those antlers, the tips sharp enough to impale. Suddenly, the deer's ears perked, and then it sprinted off toward Harrod's Lake. All was quiet. Beth exhaled. Again, this animal reminded her of the colored animal skins on Simon's cabin wall. Maybe Simon hadn't been catching animals to paint them. Maybe he'd been hunting them down because they were different, because they were wrong. Maybe it was the world that had gone mad, and not Simon. She stood on the ground the deer had just vacated and turned in a slow circle, analyzing the crushed leaves and flattened deadfall. She and Grover had gridded off the perimeter looking for evidence, finding nothing relevant before or after the 2 bodies had been moved, nothing to help make sense of why the bodies had been left there. 3 murdered bodies. 3 different moths and calling cards. 3 different killers. She started inside the crime scene tape and walked every square inch, visually combing the ground, kicking at the dry leaves. After 30 minutes of finding nothing, she closed her eyes. It was an exercise Grover had taught her soon after she'd moved in with them. Because sometimes the inner eye sees things our real eyes can't. Our memory has eyes, Beth. Close your eyes and use your memory. Warm sunlight penetrated the canopy of boughs overhead. She smelled fall leaves, heard them skittering, breeze blown around her feet, just as she had on the day she and Grover had located the corpses. Corpses Simon had drawn in such detail. The woman, her face beaten beyond recognition by the horseshoe left in her hand. She'd been raped. All evidence pointed to it, the bruising and tears, the dried blood and semen, yet the murderer had taken the time to dress her. Because she hadn't been killed here. And the man next to her, the man whose hand had held her other one. The man who had been decapitated and was holding on to his own head had not been murdered here either. And the same went for Mayor Truffant. But why? She kept her eyes closed, allowed her memory passage. The head in the man's hands. The eyes had still been open, staring at the woman beside him. Like, I see you. Like, I know who did this. No, thought Beth, that's not it. The eyes in that head, maybe they hadn't been left to stare at the dead woman beside him, but instead something off in the distance. Beth recalled the positioning of both bodies. She opened her eyes and started walking in that direction. She ducked under the crime scene tape and moved deeper into the woods. 10 yards, 20, 30. They'd been so consumed with the bodies that night, they'd neglected to perimeter this far out. 40 yards. And then a tree grabbed her attention. It was tall and black and canopied with limbs that were twisted, coiled, crooked, and bent. Unlike the trees around it, this one held no colorful leaves about to fall. In fact, it held no leaves at all, not because they'd already fallen, Beth mused, but more that it no longer grew them. But the trees seemed far from dead. Upon the bark, moths clung, hundreds of them in all colors, some stagnant, some with wings pulsing, while others moved in and around the grooved ridges of the bark, over each other, as if vying for space. Space to drink, it looked like. Or to feed. Had this tree been here before? Of course it had, but the moths they would have noticed. Beth stepped close enough to hear their movement, like maggots squirming, like bees crawling in and out of a hive. She'd been in and around these woods her entire life, and she'd never seen this tree before. Of course she had, but it had never been like this. She remembered her mother tucking her in every night. She used to tell stories. At first they were nice, innocent stories, but you demanded more. You always demanded more because Beth Gardner was scared of nothing. One night your mother gave in. You knew she read those horror books, and you wanted to read them too. It pleased you both to transition into the macabre. You bonded over those bedtime stories, and one night she told you all about the mares. How the mares at night, when you closed your eyes, crept into your house and into your bedroom and onto your chest and pressed down on you and whispered bad thoughts and gave you nightmares. You fell asleep hoping for one, hoping for a mare ride, and when it didn't happen you still asked for more. And your mother gave it because she was cool and fun and knew that you could handle it. She told you how mares can tangle the hair of little sleeping girls, and they awaken to matted, sticky plaits of mare locks. And the trees, Beth, do you want to know about the trees? If a mare touches a tree, do you know what happens? The branches become twisted and tangled as well. The bark darkens to black, and all the leaves fall off. They call them mare pines, Beth, mare trees, crooked trees. And sometimes, if a mare has touched them enough, if the mare is strong enough, the moths will come to it and drink. Have you seen one, Mama? A mare tree? No, dear, I've never seen one. It's all stories. It's all make-believe, and it's late. You better get to bed, and tell your father, if he asks, that we read green eggs and ham. What if it's not make-believe? But it is, dear, all for fun. What if the make-believe exists? What if that's what we see when we dream? Beth shook it away. Sometimes the inner I didn't know when to stop seeing. Through the moths on the tree, she saw glimpses of what appeared to be yellow paper. She stepped closer, gently moved some of the moths from it. Some scattered, some flew away and landed elsewhere on the tree. Some moved along with her hand as if bulldozed, like they'd been casually sleeping and brushed aside. And on the yellow paper nailed to the tree were words written in black ink. Cover your eyes. Oh, the Oloro is coming. Oh, go and hide. Oh, should I open them? Open, open, open them. Open, open, open them. Whoever he finds will be killed. Oh, Beth ripped the yellow paper from the tree and blew off a gray moth that had come along for the ride. It was not a lullaby she'd ever heard before, but it was the connection she'd been hoping for. Another lullaby. Silly rhymes of make-believe spoken in pleasant sing-song voices to help children go to sleep at night, often hiding their true nature, their dark inner meanings. Even Rock-a-Bye Baby has a sinister undertone. The Oloro is coming. Something is coming, Beth thought, turning the yellow paper over, reading what was on the other side. A flyer advertising the grand reopening of the historic Beehive Hotel. Chapter 28. Teddy. Before. Now that they'd finally arrived at the Beehive Hotel, Teddy was so serious about nobody getting off the Lullaby Express that he left Brandy behind on the bus to make sure. His passengers could not be trusted, especially not in public. And with the last order he'd heard through the seashell sounding more urgent than any of the previous others, telling him to forego the list for now and put rubber to the road toward Harrod's reach, Teddy couldn't afford any more hitches. No more dead bodies to hide or clean up or burn. No more delays because of the uncivilized. Just stay the fuck on the bus. Teddy was still trying to mentally process how readily and with so much enthusiasm that freak Firestarter Freddy had burned Teddy's childhood house to the ground, with their neighbor, Mrs. Chastain's decapitated body resting all peaceful like atop the kitchen table, holding her own head like that other freak from Detroit had insisted she do. But the luster in Firestarter Freddy's eyes had been something to behold. His passion for the project had been nothing short of extraordinary, and they'd had to physically move him back onto the bus as the insides of the house had started to burn. They couldn't have him standing in the yard and clapping when the fire trucks pulled in. But while Teddy had driven most of the way across the country to Harrod's Reach, Brandy had driven the initial 50 miles after leaving the Lomax house behind. Belinda Lomax, resting in her wheelchair in the handicapped section behind the driver's seat, had shown so little emotion watching her house burn that Teddy, unnerved that he couldn't get any read on her current state of mind, had been hesitant to leave. And then for that stoic expression to turn to a grin so evil it made even his skin crawl. That was almost too much. He'd wheeled her up the ramp into the Lullaby Express and insisted it was time they go. So momentarily shaken, he'd asked Brandy if she could handle the wheel. Although it wasn't only his mother's demeanor that had him rattled. He hadn't expected seeing his childhood home going up in flames to tug at him like it had done. He loved his room, yes, and the large, wooded backyard, yes, he'd miss the peaceful solitude of that. But seeing the curtain in the living room go up in flames and Freddie smile so stupidly when the flame somehow jumped to the folded blanket on the back of the sofa had reminded him too much of what his mother had done to that tree in the backyard woods when he was a boy. That tree, the one he'd found during an otherwise monotonous day of hiking and trailblazing, and for weeks had been sneaking off to read and relax and talk to the voice in his head. To imagine he was really seeing what he was seeing, all those moths which he at first thought were butterflies clinging and crawling atop the bark of that tree. It had mesmerized him. For weeks he'd visited that tree until it got to the point where he considered those moths his friends, only to accidentally mention them one evening over dinner to his mother. And once she heard about it, that was that. He realized now that she'd never asked him where the tree was. She'd somehow known and marched him right into the woods to it. The tree next to the tunnel, which was really a small, one-way, covered footbridge no more than 6 feet long, stretching over a creek that wasn't even there anymore, a creek that could have just as easily been stepped over back in its day. But this small footbridge out in the middle of the woods had never made any sense, not to them, not to any neighbors who'd ever lived near those 10 acres of backcountry Virginia woods before them. His mother marched him out to the footbridge and found the tree immediately, covered in moths, some crawling, some flying away and landing again. And within the fluttering swarm were colorful vines of purple, pink, and gold, clinging to and around the entrance of that footbridge. And on the well-worn floorboard planks a large purple snake lay coiled, head facing the tree, as if waiting to strike. Belinda Lomax hurried back to the house to grab her gas can and a book of matches, and doused both the tree and the footbridge and set them aflame, making Teddy watch as the wood snapped and burned, and the moths scattered in puffs of flame and smoke and hissing fury. Teddy had pleaded to Mother to stop, that the moths were hurt and screaming. But she stood there and made him watch, even as he cried and held his ears against the screaming moths. That memory fueled him now as he approached the Beehive Hotel. They'd arrived in the heavily forested town of Harrod's Reach under the disguise of nightfall, with virtually no one on the streets. Harrod's Reach was small and cozy and gridded by town squares. The Beehive, perched like a castle overlooking a kingdom, had not been hard to find. Still leery of any unwanted attention, Teddy had driven the Lullaby Express to the back lot, parking it off the pavement and in the shadows of the neighboring woods behind the hotel, so it wouldn't be easily seen, even in daylight. Teddy had already decided if no one answered the hotel's front door, he'd spend the rest of the night on the bus. But after he pounded on one of the Beehive's two tall, wooden doors, one painted black, the other yellow, a lobby light turned on less than a minute later. 3 houses down from the hotel, a living room light turned on and a dog barked, and in his mind Teddy urged the greasy-haired fucker he now spied through the hotel lobby window, hurrying toward the doors and tying a bathrobe, to hurry even more. The guy looked through the window and his eyes grew big, surprised, Teddy thought, that the pounding had been on his hotel door. The guy mouthed, "We're closed." Teddy said, "No, you're not." This time the man shouted through the glass, "We don't open for 3 more weeks." Teddy heard him, but could also see some wheels turning behind those blue eyes, like perhaps this goon was expecting someone at some point, but wasn't sure Teddy was the guy. Maybe taking this tall hat off would help, let him see these horns. Even though they'd long progressed past horns, according to Brandy, and Teddy, if he was being truthful, knew they were full-out fucking antlers now. Teddy removed his hat so the man could see, as he was getting a strong feeling that he wasn't the only one on this earth getting messages. His mother had gotten that Beehive Hotel grand reopening flyer from halfway across the country for a reason. After exposing the antlers, either the man would let him in, like he'd been expecting him, or would run instantly to call the cops, in which case things could get ugly. The man didn't run. In fact, he smiled, which bummed Teddy out a little. Part of him had been craving a fight. Some bruises or cuts and some blood. His tank was running low after the trip, and he needed some fuel other than sex with Brandy, which couldn't, he knew, sustain him by itself. The yellow front door opened. The guy beckoned Teddy inside and quickly closed the door behind them. Even with the lone light on above the entrance, the lobby was grand indeed. Tall and airy and spacious. According to the flyer, this was where the main party would be on opening night, with jubilant pomp and circumstance, with oysters and fancy hors d'oeuvres and signature cocktails from the original Beehive menu, all down to the most minute historical detail. The hotel man Teddy assumed he was the owner or manager despite the unruly hair and 5 o'clock shadow, was well built and handsome, and carried himself with a confidence Teddy respected. But he wouldn't stop staring at Teddy's head, at Teddy's antlers, and so Teddy curled his hand into a fist and punched the man hard in the stomach, because even though he'd not been insecure for years, he didn't like being stared at. The punch doubled the man over. From there, Teddy raised a knee into the man's face, felt the nose crack against his kneecap, and blood squirted across the white and black checked tile floor. The man rolled onto his back and moaned, holding his nose as blood gushed. He blinked moisture from his eyes, but didn't fight back. But with each moan and with each gush of blood from those busted nostrils, Teddy felt his fuel tank grow full. "My nose," said the man on his back, although it came out more like my noth due to the blood leaking over his busted lip and open mouth. The man's bathrobe had come undone, revealing his shriveled, flaccid prick. He was quick to move a hand to close the bathrobe and protect what was left of his dignity. Still on his back and eyes blurred with tears, he said, "The fuck what that for?" He had a lisp now like Firestarter Freddy. "I need rooms," said Teddy. 19 of them to be exact. "We're not open yet." Teddy leaned over him. "I have a feeling you knew I was coming." "I did," he said. "Sort of. Just not yet. You're early." "Early birds get the worm," said Teddy. "So says Mother. Speaking of whom, make that 20 rooms." The man swallowed heavily, choked on saliva and blood, but nodded that he got it. Teddy could tell he was staring at his antlers again, which in the past days had begun to sprout boughs like a reindeer. Are they real? Yes, they're fucking real. Teddy gripped the lapels of the man's bathrobe and helped him up from the floor, standing him upright so that Teddy could properly lower his head and aim for the man's sternum. It had not been something Teddy had done before, or for that matter had even imagined, using these things as weapons, but he suddenly felt the calling to do it. Teddy took 2 steps back for some room, for some momentum, and then charged, ramming the tips of his antlers into his chest, piercing flesh in at least 3 places before pulling free. The man staggered, shocked and feeling the new wounds in his chest, now bleeding through his bathrobe. Not fatal wounds, for sure, thought Teddy, but ones that would scar, and he felt his fuel tank overflowing. He wished Brandy had been here to see it. The man held out a hand toward Teddy as if to keep him at bay. Like he didn't understand why he was being attacked after willingly allowing this stranger inside his hotel. But I'm not a stranger, am I? You've heard of me before. You knew I was coming. Don't, pleaded the man, his voice sounding better as his busted lip lisp left him. I'll get you rooms. I'll kick out some workers if I need to. When do you need them? Teddy checked his watch, stepped closer. Within the next 5 minutes. Don't, please. I'm done hurting you, said Teddy. But you needed to know who is boss, am I right? The man nodded frantically. Because this is my hotel now, said Teddy, and the man nodded at that too. Good, I'm glad we're in agreement. Teddy pulled the yellow flyer from his pocket and unfolded it. This was sent to my mother's house. It had a profound effect on her. Why? What's your mother's name? Belinda Lomax, said Teddy. Does the name ring a bell? And why did she get one? I don't know. The name, yes, I remember sending it. But, do you hear voices? Asked Teddy. No, check that. Do you hear a certain voice? The man nodded, tried to plug the blood oozing from his wounds, but didn't seem to know which ones were the most important to contain. Teddy was tired of watching him struggle. One of my passengers, she calls herself the nanny, claims to have been a nurse. I'll have her attend to the wounds. Now answer my question. Yes. Yes, what? I hear a voice. Who does it belong to? Mr. Lullaby, he said quickly. He calls himself Mr. Lullaby. How does he contact you? The man scrambled for the pocket of his bathrobe and pulled from it a light blue seashell, the size of a baseball. His blood-stained hand shook, holding it. It surprised Teddy none that the man always kept it on his person. Teddy didn't like to be away from his either, but this was interesting. So where were this guy's horns? This told Teddy a couple of things. 1, this guy was just another spoke in the wheel, being used, and 2, Teddy felt now more than ever that he was the wheel itself. The man held the shell up to his ear for a listen, as if to prove a point, and then lowered his arm again. I can hear him. Through here, sometimes. He held up the shell. I don't know how, but it started when you what? Entered the tunnel, he said, 2 years ago. Is that when you decided to buy this place? Yes, he said, wincing. I'd had this hotel listed for years, trying to sell it. But that day, after leaving the tunnel, I heard a voice inside it. Maybe it was the wind. Or in my head. I don't know. What did the voice say? He chuckled, like an anxious reaction to the prospect of bleeding out on his hotel floor, more than anything comical. It said, yellow ball, right corner pocket. Yellow ball. Right corner pocket, Teddy finished for him. Interesting, then what? I'd only left the beehive 20 minutes prior. I recalled seeing the billiards room doors open, when I typically made sure they were closed. It's an ornate room. Can't wait to see it myself. It packs more of a punch to open the doors and allow the prospective buyers an entrance, like they're being swooned. I returned to the beehive, entered the billiards room, and right there on the table was a yellow ball and a cue stick. And inside the right corner pocket, he held out the shell. I found this. And that, as they say, said Teddy, is fucking that. The man nodded. Teddy stepped closer, held out his hand. The man flinched, probably thinking he was about to get hit again or even gored. But instead, Teddy opened his hand for a shake and said, "I don't mind the blood." The man stepped closer, held out his bloody hand. Teddy pumped it with a firm grip. "Teddy Lomax," he said. "Only my mother calls me Theodore." He surveyed the lobby, just a quick once-over before settling his eyes back on the hotel manager. "Love what you've done to the place." The man said, "The name's Mickey. Mickey French." He grinned ear to ear like he'd just realized something monumental, like he'd been waiting his entire life to say his next words. Welcome to the historic Beehive Hotel. Chapter 29. Gideon. Now, soon after Sully Dupree gripped Amy Schimpf's hand, the euphoria in the room was replaced by confused, anxious looks of okay, what now? Amy's mom, Tammy, started crying all over again. By then, Archie had left the room like a zombie to whatever part of the house he went when he needed to not be seen. Typically, it was where his current project was. They'd all learned long ago that when he was renovating, he wanted to be left alone. Way back when they'd first purchased the Smite house, he and Maxine did the work together. Then it became the job for the boys, after they were old enough to hand him whatever tool he required to be his assistants. His little apprentices, he'd call them, although he gave them very little to do. Never once had he allowed Gideon to hammer a nail, although before Sully's accident he'd begun to trust his little brother with not only the hammer but the screwdriver, and one day Gideon had even spied him helping with the handsaw. After Sully's accident at the tunnel, Archie made it a habit to work alone. Maddie comforted the woman with whom she'd driven into town. Her embrace with Tammy Schimpf looked awkward, reminding Gideon that the two women didn't really know each other. Coma was their only bond. But that bond was why they were here, and the what now looks Gideon saw around the room had an easy answer. He started around the end of Sully's bed like his pants were on fire. Maxine said, "Gideon, what's wrong?" Gideon found what he needed on the end table beside the bed. He held up the newspaper. The names Sully spoke last night. Jax wrote them down. Maddie said, "He spoke?" "We weren't here," Gideon said. "We were down the street." "Gideon's welcome home party," Maxine added. "He'd been overseas." She smiled at Maddie like she needed her to be impressed. He was awarded a Purple Heart. Maddie grinned like it had worked. Gideon shook the paper in his hand. Jax was out of the room, heard some noise, and then a voice, and came running. Whoever it was escaped out the window. We don't know if he was trying to abduct Sully or kill him or what, but it was a he. Yes. He had antlers, said Maxine. He was wearing antlers, Gideon corrected. According to Jax, like a Halloween costume or something. Gideon handed Maddie the newspaper. But when Jax returned, Sully was sitting up in bed, shouting out names. Random names. Jax wrote most of them down. "He has proof," Maxine said. "Jax, on his phone. He was leaving his wife a message at the time. He can play it for you." "No, that's fine," said Maddie. "I believe you." She looked toward the bed, where Sully and Amy still held hands, both sleeping peacefully. "Right now, I'd believe just about anything." She looked at the names on the newspaper, turning it clockwise as she read, since Jax had written them so haphazardly, up and down, sideways, wherever he could find blank space. Maddie bit her lower lip, closed her eyes. Gideon felt something stir within him, because damn, she was cute, but get it together. "Maddie, what is it? Do those names mean something?" Maddie opened her eyes like she'd been hit with some newfound sense of clarity. "These names, they're not random at all. Ever since I came out of my coma, I've had what I call memory dumps. Memories from my life, but even more so from where I was during my coma. What do you mean, where you were? Asked Maxine. Tammy's shimp perked up too. They all did. Because, perhaps, where Maddie was had something to do with where Sully and Amy were now. The names. Maddie pulled her own paper from her back pocket and unfolded it. Tammy, before I picked you up, I stayed for 3 days in a hotel in Atlanta. I'd been having dizzy spells and wasn't confident I could safely drive. That's where you remembered Amy's name, Tammy said. Yes, said Maddie. I remembered Sully's name early on. Amy's name came to me in Atlanta, but that wasn't it. She showed Gideon the paper. I remembered these names as well. All of them cross-check the names your friend wrote on that newspaper. There's 2 more on the newspaper than what I have here, but all of mine are accounted for on yours. But what does it mean? Asked Tammy. The question had been directed toward any or all of them, but Gideon settled on Maddie, who again had her eyes closed. He wondered if she might be having another memory dump right now, or was she conjuring the strength to answer what Gideon had wanted answered since she'd said, from where I was during my coma. Maddie, Gideon said, prodding, what is it? She opened her eyes, exhaled. We need to contact these people. How? Asked Maxine. We don't even know who they are or where they live. They're all... Maddie stopped, as if carefully thinking how best to explain. They're coma patients. I'm sure of it. These names, they're familiar to me. I don't know how we reach them all or how to even start. I just know that we need to get them here, right now. Why? Tammy asked. It's hard to explain. I still have holes. She gestured toward the bed. Just know that when these 2, on this bed, are unresponsive in this world. This world, said Maxine. Maddie looked frustrated but continued her thought. That they are not unresponsive over there. Their minds. Jesus, I'm sorry. Maxine said, Do you need to sit down, dear? Maybe. She looked pale. Gideon grabbed a chair and helped her into it. Maddie stared at the bed. Their minds are active, and they're doing more than you know over there. Over where? Maxine asked. Later, Gideon said to his mother, and then to Maddie. Tell us what you came here to tell us, because I doubt it was just to watch my brother hold hands with that girl. The message. She touched her temples like she was in pain or trying so hard to remember it hurt. My message was to, the seers, that's what we're called over there, but the seers, they're arguing over how best to guard the doors. Guard the doors? Maxine asked. From what? Mom, Gideon said, not now. Maddie continued, we need to bring as many as we can here together to help unite them over there, and I think it has everything to do with the tunnel here at Harrod's Reach. But dear, said Maxine, even if we find them, even if we can track them down, I don't know, Maddie said, looking at Tammy now. How did I convince you? Tammy said, by showing up at my door, by saying Sully's name and my daughter having a response to it. Her eyes grew wet, by giving me hope. Then that's what we'll do, said Maddie. We'll give them hope, said Gideon. We're strangers, said Maxine, and to all of them we'll be strangers even more. How do we convince them to come? By showing them this, said Archie Dupree from the doorway. They all turned toward Archie's voice. In his hand he held his cell phone, and on the screen played the video of Sully's hand moving toward Amy's, and then the 2 of them clutching hands. He too had tears in his eyes, and maybe, thought Gideon, a little hope in his heart. He smiled for the first time since Gideon's return home, and said again, with even more gusto this time, we show them this. Chapter 30. Beth. Now, once Beth made it out of the ravine, her cell phone had service again. As she drove, she Googled the lyrics of the weird lullaby she'd pulled from the bark of the moth-covered tree down by the tunnel. This one was a Nigerian lullaby called Baju Baju, translated to the English written on the back of the beehive's yellow flyer. She pulled to the side of the road long enough to read. The lullaby told children if they don't stay in bed with their eyes closed, harm would come. In this case, a monster will eat them. Baju Baju apparently meant some sort of mask, or as someone else another link down mused, a version of the game peekaboo. The Oro appeared to be in reference to the god Oro from the Yoruba religion. Until the past 24 hours, she'd never paid attention to how dark lullabies were. Parents might have for centuries sung them in sweet, innocent voices to get their babies to go to sleep, but how many really paid attention to the lyrics and dark undertones? Lullabies were full of monsters, full of dark, disguised by beautiful sing-song rhythms. Or was it the sinister disguised by something beautiful? Much like the colorful ivy now bordering the stone of the tunnel's southern entrance, the colorful moths on that tree down there, the colorful seashells and stark white leaves, the yellow squirrel she'd seen running loose inside Simple Simon's cottage, the glimpses of the monsters she'd seen drawn inside Simon's La La Land book, and as large and eerily foreboding as that black, antlered deer that had been outside the tunnel moments ago. It too had carried an aura of fantastical beauty. Don't get lured into fool's gold, Beth. Another favorite saying from Sheriff Meeks. Don't judge a book by its cover, and don't always assume a smile means somebody is nice. There's evil out there, Beth, and it comes in all forms. Beth pulled back out onto the road and picked up speed toward town. The lyrics on the yellow flyer followed her. Just by reading them, she couldn't tell exactly how those words might be sung, but she was doing her best to imagine it, and it made her skin crawl. 3 minutes later, she turned onto Mallard Street and slowed outside the Smite house. There was a van she didn't recognize parked on the driveway. As mind-bending as the last hour had been down inside the ravine and tunnel, she felt a sudden need to see Brody, to hug him. He was right there, 100 yards away, inside the Smite house with the Duprees. She could run in and get a quick fix. Squeeze him and smell his hair, and at least make herself feel better for having dumped him again while she worked. Always working, according to Jax, even when she was home, downstairs in her murder pit. She'd told him not to blow things out of proportion. But after that quick exchange of words that boiled down to her not spending enough time with her son, it burned how he'd stressed the word her son. She'd thought, yes, maybe Jax was right, it was a murder pit, and she always had been obsessed with what she'd collected down there. But to her it was essential. Beth thought better of it and cruised past the Smite house toward the beehive at the top of Mallard. She would have only riled Brody up to hug and run. Brody is in good hands. He'll be there when your workday is done. She pulled into the Beehive Hotel's front parking lot, mostly vacant except for a few construction vehicles. Before she got out of the car, a text came through from Jax saying men and women were coming to the fire station to volunteer in droves. He knew they couldn't all be deputized, but they were up to 15 now, not only taking their turns at the barricades in and out of town, but walking the streets and town squares, all eager to report the slightest unusual sighting or minor disturbance. She sent back a quick thanks, and then another, keep me posted. Will do, responded Jax. And then, love you. She did a double take at that, because it wasn't typical. He did love her, she knew, but not in the way a husband normally would a wife. This told her he was scared. Maybe for himself, maybe for her, probably for them both. Scared for the town. She thought about ghosting him, but then typed back, love you too. And she did. Jax had always been a dear friend, despite being a complete dick to Gideon his entire life. But that's what jealousy does, thought Beth. Early and often. Jealousy breeds contempt, and Jax had always been full of both. If she didn't love him, she never would have agreed so early on in their lives to do what she was doing, to live under such a facade. She grabbed the yellow flyer and got out of the car. Holding it now reminded her how long it had been pinned to that weird tree. It was damp and weather-soiled and stained by whatever ashy moth residue those things left behind. Beth started toward the hotel when she realized the barricades across Mallard Street had been moved, and there was no one guarding this entrance into town. This was Gideon's beat. She called him from the parking lot, Gideon sounding rushed when he answered. Beth? Gideon, where are you? I'm home. You're supposed to. I know, I'm sorry, he said. I'll explain it when I can, but where are you? I'm getting ready to knock on the door to the beehive. Why? I'll explain that when I can, she said. But what pulled you from your post? Someone arrived, he said. From Charleston, the other from Tulsa. The van she'd seen in the driveway, Beth thought. Go on. Maddie, she was a coma patient herself up until a few weeks ago. Wait, Maddie? Maddie who? Maddie Boyle, he said. Jesus, from Charleston. What? That name ring a bell. It does now, Beth thought, remembering the conversation she'd had in the middle of the night with the detective from Charleston. Go on, she said. She brought with her another little girl, Gideon said. She's in a coma as well, and you're not going to believe this, Beth, but this little girl, her name is Amy Shimp. That one doesn't register. She's one of the names Jax wrote down last night when Sully started calling them out. Amy Shimp. It was one of the names Jax had left on her voicemail. She's here, Gideon said. Maddie brought her, and as soon as we placed her on the bed next to Sully, he sounded like he'd just choked up and couldn't go on. They what, Gideon? They held hands, Beth, he said in a gush, like they somehow know each other. Beth saw a curtain move from a third-floor window at the beehive. She said to Gideon, I gotta go. We'll talk about this in a bit. Hug Brody for me. Yeah, okay, sure. Gideon? Yeah? She paused, lost her train of thought, if she'd ever had one. Nothing. Be careful. You too, he said. And Beth, there's a red bus parked in the woods behind that hotel. Beth noticed his voice had fallen away to a hushed whisper. What's wrong? Nothing, he said. Just that my mom walked back into the room. I didn't want her overhearing me talk about the hotel. Why? I don't know, just can't figure out her part in it all. You ever see her with Mickey French? The owner? Yes, but they're working together. She's running the marketing campaign, yeah, I got that. Then what? I dunno, maybe nothing. Just that I've been gone a while and she's changed. We all have. Maybe so, but I can't shake the feeling those two are more than just work partners, and Dad, he's like a zombie. Depressed isn't even the word for it. The curtain in another window moved, this time from the second floor. I gotta go. We'll discuss it later. Look for the red bus, Gideon said. Beth ended the call, closed in on the hotel's curved, brick walkway, and stopped at the double front doors, one yellow, the other black, just like it had been in the 1920s. She knocked on yellow, waited a minute, knocked again, this time on black. Open up. Sheriff's office. She peered through a side window. Mickey, I know you're in there. She saw Gideon's point about his mother. She was older than Mickey by 10 years, and the two could regularly be seen at the Dark Roast coffee shop having work meetings. Could there be more to it? She had lost weight. She had begun to dress younger, but that was nobody else's business. Beth was about to knock again when she heard footsteps on the other side. The yellow door opened wide enough for Mickey to show his battered face. His nose was bandaged. His lip was busted. His left eye bruised. Mickey, what the hell happened? Nothing, he said, looking past her, completely paranoid. What do you want? First, for you not to lie to me, who beat the shit out of you? Nobody, he stammered. I fell, down the stairs. I was tired, working too late. You know, trying to get this place ready, and I'm running out of time, so... Can I come in? No, not right now. She held up the yellow flyer with the lullaby written on the back of it facing him. This mean anything to you? No, why would it? It was written on your flyer. He hesitated, looked away. So, those were distributed all over town. Could have been anyone. Why are you really here? She folded the paper, slid it into her back pocket. Honestly, that was why she was here. Because of that flyer. But he was right. Anyone could have written it. I saw someone in one of the rooms upstairs. Two, actually. One on the third floor and one on the second. Mickey closed his eyes for a beat, opened them annoyed. What they look like? Just saw curtains move. We've been working on our air and heat system all day. That's not what I saw, she said. I thought you weren't open yet. I'm not. Then who is upstairs in those rooms? Workers. From out of town. They're staying here while the construction is ongoing. Everyone knows this. Mickey, we've had 3 murders. I know about the murders. Meeks questioned them 2 days ago. But I haven't, she said. How about you open the door and let me in so we can figure out who all we can cross off our list? He shook his head. Sorry, not without a warrant. Seriously, Mickey? You gonna go there? If I have to, he said. Look, you give me a list of who all Meeks questioned, and then I'll give you a list of all who are currently employed working on this hotel. Anybody you need to see, then I'll send them to the station. I'll escort them myself. Fair? She sighed, annoyed, but said, fine. But nobody is getting inside this hotel until the grand opening. I said fine. Just when he looked relieved, she said, You mind if I go take a look at that red bus behind your property? He sighed, scratched his head. Don't even say what bus, Mickey. I know it's back there. Really, she didn't. She hadn't seen it with her own eyes, but trusted Gideon. Again, he said. My property. You're gonna need a warrant, Beth. She started down the hotel steps toward the walkway. How about we shove the warrant up your ass, Mickey? That's professional. So is that bathrobe in the middle of the day, she said. Is that silk? He closed the lapels. Where you going? Around back, she said, to see the bus. I told you, not without a warrant. It's on my property. She ignored him. It probably was, unless it was far enough back into the trees not to be. He must have realized the same thing. He hurried down the steps after her, barefooted and rapidly tying his robe. She glanced over her shoulder at him. What really happened to your face? I told you. You fell right. She spotted the red school bus in the trees right away. Whoever had been driving it must have had a hell of a time getting it as far back into the tree line as they had, because it looked wedged in there. Desperately, almost. Like the bus had been there even before the trees had grown up around it. Maybe at nighttime it was concealed in the shadows, but not during daylight. Of course, nobody had been looking for it, and work trucks and vans had been in and out of these front and back lots for over a year now. Other than the ribbon cutting when they broke ground on renovations, most the action at the Beehive had been ignored by the public. There was almost a we'll believe it when we see it vibe. Plus, most in town knew the Beehive had always been the dream of Archie Dupree, and not this out-of-town young upstart realtor who'd seemingly stolen it out from beneath Archie's feet. How's Maxine Dupree working out? Beth asked Mickey on her way to the back of the lot toward the tree line. What? Fine? Why? Just curious. Beth glanced toward the windows on the back side of the hotel, and damn if she didn't see another curtain move. Somebody's watching me from inside that hotel, Mickey. Nobody is. I want that list at the station within the hour. You got it? Fine. He caught up to her. The slap of his bare feet on the asphalt made him appear even more pathetic. But you're not getting on that bus. What bus? She closed in on it, studied its positioning within the trees that hugged it. Expert driver, she thought, to get it nearly hidden like that? Warrant: these trees aren't your property, Mickey. Your property line ends at the pavement. It was a big sticking point when you bought this place, and we all know it. He pointed to the front left tire, turned slightly toward them and touching the parking lot, the only part of the bus technically on the hotel's property. See the tire. Show me the warrant. How about I just not search that tire? She'd already rounded the front of the bus, realizing how much time and attention had been put into painting this monstrosity. And the door painted black? How long has this bus been here, Mickey? I don't know. If you tell me a week or more, then we're gonna have some serious problems. I said I don't know. Suit yourself. She opened the door. A moth immediately flew out. She ducked aside, let it pass, and then stepped up into the bus. She instantly smelled ammonia, cleaning solvents. Mickey, she shouted, only to find him right on her heels. She pulled her gun, and that halted him for a beat. She said, "Somebody just clean this bus?" What? Did the beating you took hurt your hearing? Did somebody clean this bus? I don't know. It belongs to one of the workers. Get me I'll get you the list, he said so sharply she almost laughed. Have you seen enough? It's a clean bus. Nothing special here. Beth stared down the aisle and flanking benches. Nothing to see aside from the dozens of moths inside with them, some on the seat backs, others flying around like they were in a butterfly garden. Moths just like she'd seen smothering the bark of that tree down by the tunnel. She turned toward Mickey. One of your workers, huh? Make sure She held up a finger, or she, although I doubt a female would paint a bus this awful color, is the first person on that list. Fine. An hour, Mickey. He nodded, stepped aside as she brushed past. She removed her phone, snapped off a couple of quick pictures of the moths on the seats, hoping to catch some in mid-flight. To Mickey, she said, "Smile." He didn't. She took a photo of him anyway. She stopped behind the driver's seat. Behind the massive steering wheel, a 2-foot-long section of blue painter's tape had been stuck to the dashboard. In black Sharpie, someone had written, "The Lullaby Express." She looked at Mickey again. Make that 30 minutes. At the station. He didn't fight it. Her cell phone rang. Eyes still on Mickey, Beth answered the call. Beth, it's Natalie. Sheriff Meeks, he's talking. He's asking for you.